Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the gritty tale of how the Black Death swept through medieval Europe. Not the fairy tale version, you know, but a journey where a third of the continent vanished in the blink of an eye, reshaping societies forever. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. It's 1347, and Europe is about to have an experience worse than accidentally liking your ex's 3-year-old Instagram photo. This isn't just any ordinary year, folks. It's the year that the Black Death knocked on Europe's door like an overly persistent salesman with a particularly lethal product. But before we dive into the chaos that ensued, let's backtrack a bit to where this whole mess started, thousands of miles away in the vast lands of Asia. The Black Death was like the ultimate unwanted gift that kept on giving, and it all began in the steppes of Central Asia. Picture this. The Mongol Empire was expanding faster than the waistlines during holiday season feasts, connecting the east with the west through bustling trade routes. The Silk Road was the medieval version of the internet, a network that facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and unfortunately, some rather nasty diseases. It was along these routes that the Yersinia pestis bacterium hitched a ride, probably thinking, hey, why not see the world? Now, if you're wondering how this microscopic menace managed such a massive tour, look no further than our tiny, furry friends, the rats. These little critters were the original travel influencers, spreading the plague with the help of fleas, which acted as the bacterial Uber drivers. The fleas would bite infected rats, contract the disease, and then hop onto unsuspecting humans, spreading the love, or rather, the death. Medieval hygiene being what it was, basically non-existent, meant that rats thrived in the filth of cities and towns, making it easier for the plague to spread faster than a viral TikTok dance. Fast forward to October 1347, and the plague had made its European debut in Sicily. It probably would have had a red carpet welcome if anyone knew what was coming. 12 Genos trading ships docked at the port of Messina, and they weren't exactly bringing pasta and good vibes. Instead, they carried a sinister cargo, sailors either dead or dying, covered in mysterious black boils oozing blood and pus. It didn't take long for the port to become a hotspot for the disease, as the townsfolk soon found themselves coughing, feverish, and suffering from the same ghastly symptoms. To say the plague spread quickly is an understatement. It tore through Europe like a reality TV star's scandal through social media. Within just a few years, it had claimed the lives of about 25 million people, roughly a third of Europe's population at the time. Imagine losing one out of every 3 people you know. That kind of devastation would make even the most stoic medieval monk reconsider his life choices. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate medieval hygiene standards, or rather, the lack thereof. People in the 14th century weren't exactly known for their cleanliness. Bathing was considered a luxury, and sewage systems were, well, not much more than a suggestion. Streets were often filled with human and animal waste, creating the perfect environment for disease to thrive. It's no wonder that rats found these conditions more appealing than a 5-star hotel. But wait, there's more. The plague didn't just bring death. It also brought paranoia and scapegoating to new heights. People were desperate for answers and someone to blame. They looked at the Jews, foreigners, or anyone who seemed a bit different, accusing them of poisoning wells or casting spells. This led to horrific acts of violence and persecution, making an already dire situation even worse. In the midst of this pandemonium, some folks turned to the church, hoping for a miracle cure or divine intervention. But when prayers failed to halt the spread, others resorted to more drastic measures. Enter the flagellants, groups of zealots who believed that whipping themselves would atone for humanity's sins and appease an obviously displeased God. They marched from town to town, flogging themselves in public displays of penance, probably doing more to spread the disease than to stop it. Talk about missing the point. Amid the chaos, there were some who tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, even if it meant partying like there was no tomorrow. Because for many, there truly wasn't. The phrase, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, took on a whole new level of significance during these dark times. It was an era where gallows humor thrived, as people coped with the ever-present spectre of death with laughter and morbid jokes. Despite the grim reality, the Black Death wasn't just a story of doom and gloom. It was a turning point, a catalyst for change in European society. The massive population loss led to economic shifts, labor shortages, and eventually a re-evaluation of social structures. But that's a tale for another time. Right now, in the autumn of 1347, Europe was just beginning to grasp the magnitude of the storm that had arrived on its shores. A storm that would reshape history, one flea bite at a time. As the storm of the Black Death thundered across Europe, it left behind not just a trail of desolation, but a profound societal upheaval. Picture the medieval feudal system, a rigid, top-down hierarchy where peasants labored away like background extras in the grand drama of life. At the top sat the nobles, basking in luxury, while at the bottom, the peasantry toiled for scraps. But when the plague swept through, this system faced a shake-up more dramatic than a plot twist in a medieval soap opera. The plague's most immediate and devastating impact was the abrupt decimation of the labor force. With up to 60% mortality rates in some areas, entire villages were left eerily silent, fields untended, and the feudal landlords scratching their heads, or rather, their lice-infested scalps, wondering who would till the land. It was as if someone had hit reset on the social game board, and suddenly, peasants held a few cards of their own. With fewer workers available, the surviving peasants saw an unprecedented demand for their labor, a medieval paradigm shift if there ever was one. This wasn't just a minor salary bump. We're talking about wages doubling or even tripling in some regions. In England, for instance, agricultural wages increased by about 150% between 1348 and 1350. Think of it as a medieval workers' rights movement, minus the picket signs and catchy chants. Now, before you start imagining medieval peasants living it up like rock stars, let's pump the brakes on that fantasy. Sure, wages went up, but so did prices. The cost of goods soared as scarcity became the new norm. Bread, the staple diet of the peasantry, saw its price skyrocket. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of avocado toast inflation. So while peasants earned more, they also spent more, keeping any dreams of luxurious living firmly in check. And as if rising prices weren't enough, the landlords weren't about to let go of their power without a fight. Into the Statute of Labourers of 1351, a desperate attempt by the English crown to cap wages at pre-plague levels. Imagine trying to put a leash on a runaway horse. Futile, but they gave it a shot. Unsurprisingly, this decree wasn't exactly popular among the labourers who were now, for the first time, getting a taste of negotiation power. The landlords, on the other hand, clung to their status like it was the last slice of medieval pie. They attempted to enforce service obligations and squeeze out every last drop of labor they could from a dwindling workforce. But the peasants, emboldened by their newfound leverage, weren't having any of it. They resisted, negotiated. Some even took to the roads in search of better opportunities, a medieval version of job hopping. This tug-of-war over wages and labor wasn't just an economic scuffle. It was a catalyst for social change. The rigid class distinctions that had defined medieval life began to blur, if only slightly. The peasants were no longer just passive serfs bound to the land. They started to see themselves as participants in the economic game, albeit with limited options. It was as if the Black Death had inadvertently handed them a megaphone to voice their grievances, and they weren't shy about using it. But let's not get carried away with visions of medieval utopia. Even as the social fabric was being rewoven, the harsh realities of life persisted. The scarcity of labor may have empowered workers, but it also meant that the plague's psychological scars ran deep. Communities were fragmented, families broken, and the constant spectre of death had left an indelible mark on the collective psyche. This wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a human one. In the midst of this upheaval, some areas saw land redistribution, as abandoned properties were either reclaimed by lords or seized by enterprising peasants. However, the latter was more myth than reality. The truth was that while some peasants did benefit, many remained trapped in a cycle of poverty exacerbated by inflation and uncertainty. The Black Death may have been an equal opportunity destroyer, but its aftermath was far from evenly distributed. So, what's the takeaway here? The plague didn't just disrupt the status quo. It set the stage for a slow but inevitable transformation of medieval society. It was a catalyst, a harbinger of change, albeit wrapped in a cloak of misery. The economic shifts were profound, yet they were just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, deeper social currents were beginning to stir, ready to challenge the very foundations of feudal Europe. And as we look back on this period, it's a stark reminder of how even the darkest chapters in history can sow the seeds of change. The Black Death's grim legacy was not just one of death and despair, but also of resilience, adaptation, and the relentless march toward progress, albeit with more than a few bumps along the way. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's leave the peasants to their newfound bargaining chips and prepare for the next twist in the tale of medieval Europe. As the peasants continued to navigate their new roles in the shifting economic landscape, the political arena was morphing into a chaotic, medieval version of Game of Thrones. With the population dwindling faster than the shelf life of a medieval snack, rulers found themselves floundering, and political structures began to crack under the pressure. Some leaders seized the moment like it was a limited-time sale on power, while others crumbled like stale bread left out for the ducks. Take King Edward Roman III of England, for example. He saw the plague as an opportunity to consolidate his power and push his military ambitions in the ongoing 100 Years' War against France. He played the long game, leveraging the chaos to strengthen his grip at home and abroad. Meanwhile, his French counterpart, Philip VI, was having a rougher time. Already mired in war and economic downturns, the plague hit France like a wrecking ball, leaving chaos and a weakened monarchy in its wake. It was as if Philip had been handed a medieval lemon with no recipe for lemonade in sight. The political aftermath of the Black Death wasn't just about rulers juggling crowns, though. It was also about the scapegoating and persecution of minorities, a dark chapter in human history that's as regrettable as it is perplexing. During the plague, when the Grim Reaper seemed to be working overtime, people were desperate for someone to blame. Enter the Jews, unfortunately cast as the villains in this medieval drama. Accusations flew faster than a falcon at a royal hunt, with claims that Jews were poisoning wells and spreading the plague. The reality: these were baseless claims fueled by fear and ignorance, yet the myth had a cruel appeal, providing an easy target for society's frustrations. In 1348, the city of Strasbourg saw one of the most infamous examples of this scapegoating. For a single case of the plague had reached the city, a paranoid frenzy led to the arrest and subsequent execution of hundreds of Jews. The council, in a move more misguided than a medieval doctor prescribing leeches for every ailment, decided that purging the Jewish community would stave off the disease. On February 14, 1349, Strasbourg witnessed a mass burning of Jews in what was horrifically called the Valentine's Day Massacre. It was a brutal reminder of how fear can warp judgment and lead to unspeakable acts of violence. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, Jews were expelled from cities, tortured into confessions, and massacred in large numbers. In Mainz and Cologne, entire Jewish communities were annihilated. These actions were often sanctioned by local authorities who either believed the rumors or opportunistically used them to eliminate debts owed to Jewish moneylenders. It was a medieval mix of bigotry and economics, a grim testament to the darker side of human nature. Yet, it wasn't all doom and gloom for those in power. Some rulers managed to ride the storm, using the chaos as a springboard for reform. The city-state of Florence, for instance, emerged from the Black Death with a renewed focus on governance and public health. The city's leaders initiated public works projects and reorganized their government to include a broader representation of the populace. These changes laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, a cultural rebirth that would transform Europe in the centuries to come. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Charles Roman IV saw the plague as a divine call to reform his administration. He enacted the Golden Bull of 1356, a decree that standardized the election process for future emperors, reducing internal conflict and paving the way for a more stable political environment. It was a savvy move by Charles, who managed to maintain his reign amidst the chaos, proving that not all medieval rulers were doomed to be pawns of fate. In this period of turmoil, the church wasn't sitting idly by either. With the plague decimating congregations and clergy alike, the church found itself in a precarious position. Its spiritual authority was under siege as people questioned God's role in the disaster. Some church leaders doubled down on their faith, while others saw an opportunity for reform. The Avignon papacy, already contentious for its relocation from Rome, faced increased scrutiny. As the church struggled to provide answers, its influence began to wane, setting the stage for future religious upheavals. Amid all this chaos, the art of politics was as much about survival as it was about governance. Rulers had to juggle the expectations of their subjects, the shifting power dynamics, and the ever-present specter of the plague. It was a precarious dance where one misstep could lead to downfall. Yet, in the strangest of ways, the Black Death served as a catalyst for political change, reshaping the landscape in ways no one could have predicted. But let's not get carried away with the idea that the political world became some utopian playground of reform. For every ruler who managed to navigate the storm, there were those who were swept away by its tides. The kingdom of Castile, for instance, saw its power structures falter as the plague exacerbated existing tensions between the nobility and the monarchy. King Alfonso, Roman XI, died of the plague in 1350, leaving a power vacuum that led to civil unrest and conflict over succession. The political chaos of the Black Death era was a crucible, testing the mettle of leaders and the resilience of their realms. It was a period that revealed both the best and worst of human nature. While some leaders rose to the occasion, others fell victim to the very chaos they sought to control. It was a time when the allure of power was as intoxicating as it was dangerous, a medieval high-wire act with no safety net. As Europe stumbled through this period of upheaval, the seeds were sown for future change. The experience of the Black Death left an indelible mark on the continent, shaping its political, social, and economic fabric. It was a time of endings and beginnings, a pivotal moment that would reverberate through history. And so, the story of the Black Death continues, a tale not just of death and destruction, but of transformation and resilience. A reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity finds ways to adapt, survive, and eventually thrive. But the journey is far from over. There are more twists and turns to come as Europe grapples with the legacy of the plague and the new world it has unwittingly created. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this epic saga of survival and change. Now, as the dust, or rather the fleas, began to settle over Europe, one might think that the continent would finally get a breather. No, the Black Death had other plans, and it decided to crash the cultural and religious scene like an uninvited guest at a medieval feast. Let's start with the spiritual schism that was as dramatic as a medieval soap opera. The Black Death was a divine curveball that left people questioning everything. Was the plague a test from God, a punishment, or just the universe's way of playing a cruel joke? The Church, which had been the go-to institution for all things existential, found itself under the medieval equivalent of a Twitter storm. It was like when your favorite influencer lets you down, and you start questioning all your life choices. Some folks doubled down on faith, turning to the church in droves, hoping for salvation through prayer and penance. The church's coffers swelled with donations as people attempted to buy divine favor, because if you can't bribe God, who can you bribe? Meanwhile, others grew disillusioned, seeing the clergy's failure to stop the plague as a divine unfollow. When monks and nuns started falling sick too, the church's promise of divine protection seemed about as reliable as medieval plumbing. Cue the flagellants, the religious zealots who took the art of self-punishment to a whole new level. These folks decided that the best way to appease an angry deity was through a little DIY suffering. So they formed traveling bands, wandering from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of devotion that were as much performance art as penance. The spectacle was captivating, part religious revival, part medieval reality show, but it did little to actually stop the plague. Instead, it likely spread it further, as these groups ignored quarantine measures like they were mere suggestions. But it wasn't all about self-flagellation and failed miracles. The Black Death also sparked a cultural shift that was as surprising as it was transformative. Enter the world of macabre art, a genre that blossomed like a particularly morbid flower in the fertile soil of post-plague Europe. Artists, grappling with the omnipresence of death, began to create works that reflected the grim reality of the times. Skeletons danced alongside the living, and the dance of death became a popular motif. It was like the medieval version of a heavy metal album cover, reminding everyone that death was the ultimate equalizer. This art wasn't just about shock value. It was a profound commentary on the human condition. The Black Death had stripped away the illusions of immortality, leaving behind a stark reminder of life's fragility. It was a wake-up call that resonated deeply, echoing through the halls of monasteries and the streets of bustling cities alike. But here's the kicker. As macabre as this art was, it laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. Yep, that cultural explosion of art, science, and humanism that we all know and love had its roots in the bleak soil of the plague years. The Black Death had inadvertently sparked a thirst for knowledge and innovation as the survivors sought to understand the world anew. It was as if, faced with the spectre of death, humanity decided to throw itself into life with renewed vigor. And speaking of innovation, let's not forget the medical advancements that emerged from this grim era. Sure, medieval medicine was often more guesswork than science. Think leeches and bloodletting. But the Black Death pushed healers to rethink their approach. The carnage was a wake-up call that maybe, just maybe, there was room for improvement in the whole curing people business. As the plague ravaged Europe, medical practitioners began to take a more systematic approach to understanding disease. They started documenting symptoms, outcomes, and even attempted early forms of quarantine. The plague doctors, with their iconic beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, became symbols of this new medical mindset. These physicians were more about trial and error than evidence-based practice. But hey, baby steps. In Italy, for instance, cities like Venice pioneered quarantine stations, known as lazarettos. Ships arriving from infected ports were isolated for 40 days, a practice from which we get the term quarantine, derived from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. These measures were rudimentary, but represented a giant leap towards understanding disease transmission. And while we're on the subject of innovation, let's give a nod to the impact on public health. The Black Death exposed the squalid living conditions in medieval cities. Think open sewers and overcrowded dwellings. In response, some cities began to implement basic sanitation measures, paving the way for future public health initiatives. It was like the medieval version of a city council finally deciding to fix that pothole-filled street after years of complaints. Yet, despite these glimmers of progress, the legacy of the Black Death was far from uniform. It left a patchwork of change across Europe, with some regions embracing reform, while others clung to the old ways like barnacles on a ship's hull. The social, cultural, and religious landscape was forever altered, setting the stage for the seismic shifts to come. So, what's the takeaway from this cultural and religious roller coaster? The Black Death was a paradox, a disaster that sowed the seeds of renewal. It was a grim reminder of mortality that inspired both despair and innovation. And while it's easy to romanticize the resilience of the human spirit, the reality was messy, uneven, and fraught with challenges. As we look back on this era, it's clear that the Black Death was more than just a historical footnote. It was a catalyst for change that forced society to confront its limitations and push beyond them. The echoes of this period reverberate through history, reminding us that even in the darkest times, there is the potential for growth and transformation. But the story isn't over yet. The cultural and religious impacts of the Black Death were just the beginning of a larger narrative, a narrative that would see Europe rise from the ashes of plague and persecution to embrace a new dawn. So stay tuned as we continue to unravel the threads of this complex tapestry, exploring how the Black Death set the stage for the rebirth of a continent. So, as Europe dusted off its collective hands after the Black Death's chaotic visit, it was like waking up after a particularly wild party. The kind where you're not entirely sure what happened, but you know things will never be quite the same again. The plague had reshuffled the deck of medieval life, leaving a new hand of cards that would eventually lead to the rise of the modern world. But how, you ask, did a catastrophic event that wiped out up to 60% of the population in some areas become the unlikely spark for progress? Buckle up, because history's wild ride is just getting started. First off, let's talk demographics. With a population knocked down like a row of dominoes, Europe suddenly found itself with a labor shortage more severe than your local coffee shop on a Monday morning. This scarcity of workers wasn't all bad news, though. It shifted the balance of power in favor of the common folk. Wages rose, serfdom began its slow decline, and peasants became the medieval version of free agents, shopping their labor around for the best deal. Imagine that, peasants with options. The social hierarchy that had been as rigid as a knight's armor was now more like a slightly bent spoon. In addition to better wages, the sudden availability of land also played a crucial role in reshaping society. With so many people gone, land ownership that was once tightly held by the nobility began to change hands. Some peasants seized the opportunity to buy plots of land, turning from laborers into landowners faster than you can say economic mobility. This wasn't just a small shift, it was a tectonic movement in the social landscape. By the mid-15th century, England saw the rise of a new class, the yeoman farmers, who were neither serfs nor full-fledged gentry, but something intriguingly in between. This emergence hinted at the social mobility that would eventually become a hallmark of modern society. On the economic front, the Black Death was like hitting the reset button. The scarcity of workers meant that the agricultural sector, which had been the backbone of medieval economies, had to innovate or perish. Crop diversification became a necessity, and some regions shifted from grain-heavy production to more lucrative ventures like sheep farming. Wool, it turned out, was the medieval equivalent of Bitcoin, a hot commodity that could make fortunes. English wool, in particular, became the darling of European markets, laying the groundwork for England's rise as a commercial powerhouse. But it wasn't just the fields that were changing. The urban centres were experiencing a renaissance of their own, quite literally. With fewer mouths to feed, there was more surplus wealth, and this newfound capital was often invested in burgeoning city economies. Artisans and craftsmen saw a boom in demand for their goods as people with disposable income sought luxury items like fine textiles, jewelry, and art. This uptick in urban prosperity was like Miracle-Gro for the roots of the Renaissance, nurturing a cultural and intellectual blossoming that would redefine Europe. Now, let's tackle the elephant, or should I say, the rat, in the room, the myth that the Black Death was all doom and gloom. Sure, it was one of history's most devastating pandemics, but its legacy isn't solely about destruction. It's a testament to humanity's adaptability, showcasing how societies can evolve under pressure. The very fabric of medieval life was ripped apart, but in its place grew something stronger, more resilient. It was as if Europe had been given a crash course in survival tactics, emerging from the ordeal with a renewed sense of purpose. Politically, the plague set off a chain reaction that would eventually lead to the decline of feudalism and the rise of centralized nation-states. Monarchs, who had previously been more ceremonial figureheads than actual rulers, seized the opportunity to consolidate power. With the nobility weakened, both in numbers and influence, kings and queens began to centralize authority, laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state. Take England, for instance. The Tudor dynasty, which rose to power shortly after the plague years, capitalized on this shift, strengthening royal control and redefining governance. The Black Death also forced a re-evaluation of the Church's role in society. With its spiritual authority shaken, the Church had to adapt or risk becoming obsolete. This period of introspection and reform would eventually contribute to the conditions leading up to the Protestant Reformation. The seeds of religious change were sown in the fertile ground of plague-induced doubt and questioning. People began to seek spiritual fulfillment outside traditional church structures, setting the stage for seismic shifts in religious thought. And speaking of thought, let's not overlook the intellectual revolution spurred by the Black Death. The tragedy underscored the limitations of contemporary science and medicine, leading to a gradual but significant shift towards empirical observation and experimentation. This newfound emphasis on evidence over dogma was a precursor to the scientific revolution. The plague had inadvertently lit a fire under the quest for knowledge, pushing humanity towards a future where understanding the natural world became a priority. So, what's the grand takeaway from this historical whirlwind? The Black Death wasn't just a chapter of calamity, it was a catalyst for transformation. an agent of change that forced Europe out of its medieval shell and into a more modern era. It's a powerful reminder that even the darkest moments can lead to unexpected progress. History, as they say, is a great teacher, and the Black Death is one of its most poignant lessons. Resilience is born from adversity, and transformation often arises from the ashes of destruction. As we face our own global challenges today, from pandemics to political upheaval, the story of the Black Death offers a beacon of hope. It shows us that while the road may be fraught with peril, it also holds the promise of renewal and growth. So, let's take a page from the past, embrace the lessons learned, and navigate the future with an eye towards resilience and innovation. After all, if history has taught us anything, it's that humanity's capacity for adaptation is as boundless as its imagination. In the flickering glow of candlelight, you find yourself surrounded by a curious mix of manuscripts, vials, and the unmistakable aroma of something that might just be burning. Welcome to the world of medieval alchemy, a time when the line between science and magic was about as clear as the murky concoctions brewing in your cauldron. Alchemists, those ambitious trailblazers of transformation, were convinced that they could transmute base metals into gold, unlock the elixir of life, and maybe even find the secret to immortality. Spoiler alert, they didn't, but their peculiar diets. Now that's a story worth chewing over. You see, alchemists were the original you-are-what-you-eat crowd, long before kale smoothies became a thing. They believed that consuming the right foods could grant them the power to manipulate the very essence of matter. We're not talking about a medieval version of a balanced diet here, no kale or quinoa in sight. Instead, think mercury, arsenic, and other tasty poisons. Yum, right. Let's start with mercury, that shimmering, silvery liquid that flips between solid and liquid like it can't make up its mind. Alchemists saw mercury not just as a metal, but as a symbol of transformation. They thought ingesting it could help them unlock the secrets of transmutation. In reality, it was more like unlocking a world of health problems. Mercury poisoning can cause neurological damage, tremors, and a variety of other symptoms that are about as pleasant as a medieval dentist. Yet, for those determined alchemists, the promise of enlightenment was worth the risk. Then there's arsenic, the classic poison of choice for anyone wanting to deal with a pesky rival. Alchemists believed that its ability to transform into various compounds symbolized the potential for personal and spiritual transformation. How poetic. Unfortunately, the side effects included a less than charming array of symptoms: vomiting, diarrhea, and eventual death if consumed in large enough quantities. But hey, who needs a long life when you're on the brink of discovering the philosopher's stone? Now, if you're wondering why these ancient scientists were so obsessed with potentially lethal substances, it's all about the allure of the unattainable. The philosopher's stone, that legendary substance that could turn lead into gold and grant eternal life, was the ultimate prize. The belief that through suffering and sacrifice, like ingesting mercury and arsenic, you could achieve something extraordinary was a powerful motivator. It's a tale as old as time. Humans are forever drawn to the promise of magic just beyond their reach, even if it means skirting dangerously close to the edge. To really get into their heads, consider the economic backdrop of medieval Europe. Gold was more than just a shiny metal. It was the currency of power, the ticket to influence, and the key to survival in a world where wealth determined your fate. With gold reserves limited and the demand ever increasing, the ability to create gold from simple metals would have been a game changer. You can almost hear the clinking of coins as alchemists fantasized about the riches they could amass. This wasn't just about scientific curiosity. It was about ambition, survival, and a dash of greed. Now, before you dismiss these alchemists as simply misguided, remember that they were also pioneers. Their attempts to understand the natural world laid the groundwork for modern chemistry. Even their failures, often spectacular and sometimes deadly, helped illuminate the path for future scientists. It's a classic case of stumbling upon progress while blindly groping in the dark. The alchemists' strange diets, while bafflingly dangerous, were part of their broader quest for knowledge and power. In this world of fire and fumes, you can almost hear the whispers of their bubbling parts, the scribbles of their quills, and the coughs. A lot of coughs, thanks to inhaling who knows what. Alchemy was as much about philosophy as it was about experiment. The idea that consuming elements could bring about a spiritual transformation was rooted in a broader worldview that saw the material and spiritual as intertwined. In this sense, the alchemists were like the medieval version of today's biohackers, pushing the boundaries of diet and health in pursuit of something greater. So next time you're tempted to try the latest health fad, remember the alchemists. They remind us that the pursuit of the extraordinary can lead to breakthroughs, or at the very least, some interesting dinner conversation. And while the philosopher's stone might still be out of reach, the legacy of these medieval scientists lives on, not just in the history of chemistry, but in the timeless human quest to transform the world and ourselves. So, speaking of dinner conversations, let's slide into the economic buffet of medieval Europe, where the table was set with a peculiar mix of scarcity and opulence. If you're wondering why alchemists were so keen on munching on mercury and arsenic, it's crucial to peek behind the curtains of their time. The medieval economy was like a juggling act with too many flaming torches and not enough hands. Gold was in high demand and short supply, making it the ultimate currency, the big cheese, the key to unlocking doors that otherwise remained firmly shut. Picture this. You're an alchemist in the 14th century, scouring the markets not for groceries, but for ingredients that could burn a hole in your pocket faster than a dragon's breath. Let's talk costs. Mercury, for instance, wasn't just sitting around in little bottles at your medieval local apothecary. The stuff was mined, often in far-flung places like Almaden in Spain, and transported with all the care of a delicate Fabergé egg. Prices fluctuated wildly, but an ounce of mercury could cost you the equivalent of a nice dinner at a mid-range inn, assuming you could find a seller willing to part with it. And arsenic? Well, it wasn't exactly the salt of the earth, but it was more accessible, often derived from arsenopyrite minerals. Still, it wasn't cheap, and despite its toxic reputation, it was a staple for anyone dabbling in the dark arts of alchemy. When you're trying to crack the code of eternal life or turn lead into gold, you're willing to shell out. The irony, of course, is that while they sought gold, they spent small fortunes in the process. It's like trying to save money by buying a yacht. Now, let's talk about the broader medieval marketplace, a chaotic bazaar of goods, services, and sometimes questionable hygiene. Trade routes crisscrossed the continent, from the bustling fairs of Champagne to the exotic markets of the Levant. It was a world where peppercorns could be worth their weight in gold, and the Silk Road wasn't just a metaphor, but a literal path to riches. The alchemists, with their strange diets, were not just eccentric scientists. They were active participants in an economy that valued rarity and novelty as much as necessity. This brings us to the social ladder, a precarious structure where one misstep could send you tumbling into obscurity or worse. The allure of alchemy wasn't just the promise of gold, but the tantalizing prospect of social mobility. In a society where birth often determined fate, the philosopher's stone was a wild card, a potential ticket to the big leagues. Imagine the appeal. A humble scholar could, through wit and a bit of luck, and maybe some mercury poisoning, rise to the status of a noble. It was the medieval version of a rags-to-riches story, only with more lead and fewer PowerPoint presentations. As we unravel this tangled web, it's clear that alchemy was as much about ambition as it was about understanding the natural world. The diets of these medieval scientists, bizarre as they were, symbolized a deeper yearning for transformation, both personal and societal. They lived in an era where every meal was a gamble, every experiment a step into the unknown. And yet, driven by dreams of gold and glory, they pressed on. The social hierarchy of the time was a volatile beast, a teetering stack of power and privilege that could shift with the slightest nudge. A successful alchemist could upset the established order, challenging the status quo with a single breakthrough. The philosopher's stone wasn't just a symbol of alchemical success. It was a metaphor for the potential to rewrite one's destiny. In this way, the diets of alchemists were more than just a quirky footnote in history. They were a reflection of the world they lived in, a world hungry for change. So, as we chew over this complex stew of economics, ambition, and alchemical aspiration, it's clear that the quest for the philosopher's stone was more than just a science experiment gone slightly mad. It was a journey into the heart of medieval society, where every bite of mercury or arsenic was a step towards an elusive dream. And while the alchemists never found the stone, they left behind a legacy that continues to intrigue and inspire. But hey, don't go reaching for the mercury just yet. We've still got more ground to cover in the strange and fascinating world of medieval alchemy. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, as we continue to peel back the layers of medieval alchemy like the most peculiar onion you've ever seen. The idea that munching on mercury or sipping on arsenic could somehow lead you to enlightenment makes for a great story. But was it really anything more than early snake oil? Spoiler alert, not quite. Let's address the glamorous myth of alchemists as wise sages hunched over bubbling cauldrons, one bite away from cosmic understanding. Sure, it sounds mystical, but the reality, more like a medieval version of trial and error with a dash of wishful thinking. Primary sources from the time, such as the writings of Roger Bacon or Albertus Magnus, often reveal that alchemists were less about revelatory epiphanies and more about rigorous experimentation, albeit with some misguided culinary choices. Take the infamous mercury diet. If we look at primary accounts, like those of the Arab alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, mercury was considered the spirit of metals. Yet, there's a glaring absence of evidence that suggests any of these experiments led to the enlightenment they so craved. Instead, they often led to a bit of madness, and not the kind that results in genius breakthroughs. Mercury poisoning was more likely to leave you with tremors and a whole host of neurological issues than a golden vista of insight. Arsenic, on the other hand, was the alchemist's equivalent of a Hail Mary pass. The belief was that its volatility held the key to unlocking the mysteries of transformation. But alas, the only real transformation was often a quick trip to the afterlife. Historical investigations into the writings of the time, such as those of Paracelsus, show a genuine attempt to decipher the properties of arsenic. Yet, despite their best efforts, the result was often a rather grim reminder of the limits of medieval science. This brings us to the role of patronage, the economic and social lifeline for many an alchemist. Let's face it, it's hard to pursue the secrets of the universe on an empty stomach. Wealthy patrons, often nobles or even royalty, were eager to sponsor alchemists in hopes of striking it rich with the philosopher's stone. These patrons were the venture capitalists of their day, investing in alchemists not just for the promise of gold, but for the allure of power and prestige. Imagine King Edward Roman III of England, who reportedly housed and funded alchemists in the 14th century to discover the elusive substance. Talk about high stakes. In return, alchemists promised their sponsors not just wealth, but the ultimate cheat code to immortality. The philosopher's stone was the medieval equivalent of a winning lottery ticket, if only it were real. However, the relationship between alchemists and their patrons was often more transactional than mystical. Think of it as a high-stakes game of medieval poker, where the buy-in was your health and possibly your sanity. The truth is, while the legends paint alchemists as mystical figures on the brink of divine revelation, the reality was far more grounded and grim. Many alchemists were scholars, yes, but they were also hustlers, navigating the tricky waters of patronage and expectation. The promise of turning lead into gold was just as much about keeping the patrons' coffers open as it was about scientific discovery. The economic context of the time can't be ignored either. Alchemy thrived in an era where the balance of power was precarious, and a sudden influx of gold could tip the scales. For the wealthy, investing in alchemy was a bet on the future, a gamble that could lead to untold riches. But for the alchemists themselves, it was often a tightrope walk between innovation and insolvency, with the risk of failure looming large. In this light, the true legacy of alchemy isn't mystical wisdom or magical transformations, but the spirit of inquiry that it inspired. The alchemists' strange diets and their relentless pursuit of the philosopher's stone laid important groundwork for the scientific method. They were pioneers in their own right, not because they succeeded in their lofty goals, but because they dared to dream big and challenge the status quo. So, while the alchemists might not have found the enlightenment they sought through their peculiar diets, their efforts were far from wasted. They remind us that the pursuit of knowledge often involves more failures than successes, and that each misstep is a step closer to understanding. And as we continue to dig into their world, one thing is clear. The story of alchemy is a rich tapestry of human ambition, curiosity, and yes, a bit of madness. But hold tight, because we're not done unraveling this tale just yet. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of alchemical living, because running a medieval lab was no small feat, my friend. Imagine trying to whip up a philosopher's stone while your neighbor is still figuring out fire. Yep, the practicalities of alchemy were just as perplexing as the potions themselves. First off, you needed a space to work your magic, a laboratory. Unlike today's sleek, white-coated labs filled with fancy gadgets, a medieval alchemist's lab was more of a chaotic brew of chaos itself. Picture a dimly lit room packed to the rafters with strange apparatuses like alembics and crucibles. It's a miracle the place didn't spontaneously combust every other Tuesday. But let's not forget about funding. Setting up a lab wasn't cheap. Remember, these alchemists weren't just hoarding ingredients. They were investing in the medieval equivalent of a startup. You needed a patron, someone with deep pockets and even deeper dreams of gold. Without financial backing, your lab would be nothing more than a dusty attic filled with pipe dreams and broken glassware. Now, about those ingredients. We're talking about a shopping list that would make a modern chemist break out in hives. Alchemists needed everything from sulfur to saltpeter, and let's not overlook the more exotic fare like dragon's blood and unicorn horn. Okay, maybe not the latter, but you get the idea. They were on a constant treasure hunt for rare elements, and it wasn't just a matter of popping down to the local market. Take mercury, for example. This wasn't just something you could pick up at your friendly neighborhood alchemist supply store. No, mercury had to be sourced from places like Almaden, Spain, which meant long, arduous journeys over mountains and across seas. This wasn't a weekend road trip. It was a months-long expedition, fraught with danger, and that's just for a few ounces of liquid metal. Arsenic, surprisingly, was a bit easier to come by, often found closer to home in mineral deposits. But its accessibility didn't make it any less perilous to handle. Alchemists had to tread carefully, balancing their need for volatile substances with the very real risk of poisoning. It's the medieval version of cooking meth in your basement, except you're really hoping for gold, not Breaking Bad. Once you've painstakingly gathered your ingredients, there's the small matter of actually using them. Alchemical processes were about as predictable as a medieval weather forecast. You'd spend days, weeks, maybe even months distilling, calcining, and fermenting substances, all while hoping you didn't accidentally blow yourself up or poison your best apprentice. Safety goggles. Try squinting through a cloud of lead fumes instead. Let's spotlight a couple of these intrepid alchemists who braved such conditions. Take John of Rupasissa, a 14th century friar who found himself immersed in the world of alchemy while dodging the Inquisition. Rupasissa was convinced that alcohol distilled from wine could act as a universal remedy, a proto-vodka cure-all, if you will. His dedication to alchemical experiments was so intense, he was eventually imprisoned for sorcery. Talk about dedication to the craft. Then there's George Ripley, whose 15th century opus, The Compound of Alchemy, was a bestseller in its day. Ripley's work was a treasure map for aspiring alchemists, filled with cryptic illustrations and allegories. While Ripley never found the philosopher's stone, his writings inspired generations, proving that a good story can be as valuable as the gold itself. And let's not overlook the geographical challenges. Europe was a patchwork of principalities, each with its own rules and regulations. Transporting a concoction from one region to another could involve dodging border guards and paying hefty tolls. It was like trying to smuggle a rare wine from France to England, only with more lead and less flavor. These alchemists weren't just scientists. They were adventurers, braving the wilds of medieval Europe in search of enlightenment. The logistics of maintaining a laboratory were equally daunting. Equipment needed constant care. Furnaces had to be stoked, bellows pumped, and glassware meticulously cleaned. The daily grind involved a delicate dance between chemistry and catastrophe, with a side of existential dread thrown in for good measure. Despite the challenges, the alchemist's quest was as much about personal transformation as it was about chemical transmutation. Their daily struggles mirrored their internal battles, a desire to transcend the mundane through the mysteries of matter. The lab was both a sanctuary and a crucible, where dreams of gold were forged and often shattered. In this world of fire and fumes, the alchemist's life was a testament to the enduring human spirit. They were the original mad scientists, driven by a desire to unlock the secrets of the universe. one failed experiment at a time. And while their methods might seem bizarre by today's standards, their legacy is anything but. So, as we journey deeper into the world of medieval alchemy, remember that these were not just men and women playing with fire. They were pioneers, charting a course through the unknown with nothing but their wits and a few volatile compounds. Their story is one of daring and determination, a testament to the lengths humanity will go in its quest for knowledge. Keep your eyes on the bubbling cauldron, because there's more alchemical intrigue just around the corner. And just like that, we find ourselves staring into the bubbling cauldron of the Alchemists' legacy, a heady brew of ambition, folly, and, believe it or not, science as we know it today. Let's stir the pot and see what rises to the surface. First off, let's get one thing straight. Alchemy wasn't just a medieval episode of my strange addiction with a penchant for poisonous snacks. It was humanity's earnest attempt to decode the universe using the only tools they had, guts and a questionable diet. Alchemists may have been misguided in munching on mercury and arsenic like it was the medieval equivalent of kale, but their curiosity was the spark that lit the fire of modern science. Fast forward to the dawn of chemistry, alchemy's less mystical, more practical offspring. The alchemists didn't find the philosopher's stone, but they did pave the way for the likes of Robert Boyle and Antoine Lavoisier. Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, stood on the shaky shoulders of alchemists when he penned The Skeptical Chimist in 1661, dismantling the idea of classical elements in favor of the chemical elements we recognize today. Lavoisier later named oxygen, a feat of categorization that probably had more to do with precise observation than chowing down on mercury. But still, props to the alchemists for getting the ball rolling. And let's talk about medicine. While alchemists were busy trying not to poison themselves, they inadvertently laid the groundwork for pharmacology. Paracelsus, a Swiss physician and alchemist, boldly proclaimed that dosage made the poison, a radical idea back in the 16th century. His assertion that diseases had specific causes and could be treated with specific substances was revolutionary. So next time you pop an aspirin, give a nod to those mercury-sipping forebears who dared to think outside the alchemical box. Now, as for those bizarre diets, sure, they didn't lead to enlightenment or eternal youth, unless you count the enlightenment of realizing what asterisk not asterisk to eat. But they did underscore a vital aspect of human nature, our relentless curiosity and willingness to risk it all for a glimpse into the unknown. If that's not the essence of scientific inquiry, I don't know what is. But let's not sugarcoat it. A healthy dose of skepticism is always in order. The allure of alchemy was steeped in the promise of power and wealth. In a world where gold dictated social status, the philosopher's stone was the ultimate carrot on a stick. And while the idea of transforming lead into gold remains a tantalizing fantasy, we must remember that the true value of alchemy lies not in the gold that never was, but in the knowledge that eventually came to be. Speaking of fantasies, we can't ignore the intoxicating romance of alchemy. There's a reason it continues to capture our imagination, long after its golden promises have faded. It's the same reason we're drawn to tales of buried treasure or the fountain of youth, a yearning for magic in a world bound by rules. Alchemy, with its enigmatic symbols and cryptic texts, taps into our desire to believe in the extraordinary. It's a story that refuses to die, precisely because it dances on the edge of possibility and impossibility. Even as we debunk the myths of alchemy, we can't help but admire the tenacity of those medieval dreamers. Their failures are a testament to their bravery, their willingness to venture into the unknown with nothing but hope and a handful of dubious ingredients. They remind us that the path to discovery is often littered with mistakes, and that each misstep is a step closer to something greater. In the grand tapestry of history, alchemy holds a unique thread, weaving together science, art, and a touch of madness. It's a reminder that progress is rarely linear, and that the pursuit of knowledge often takes us down winding roads and into dark alleys, only to emerge into the light with new understanding. So, as we close the book on the alchemical diets of yore, let's raise a metaphorical glass of elixir, not to immortality or boundless wealth, but to the enduring spirit of inquiry that drives us to explore the unknown, even if it means munching on a little mercury along the way. Because in the end, it's not about finding the philosopher's stone. It's about the journey we take in search of it. And who knows, maybe that's a kind of alchemy all its own. In the year 1028, a child was born in the turbulent land of Normandy, a place where bloodlines were as tangled as a medieval soap opera plot. This child, William, would someday be known as the Conqueror, but at the start, he was simply the son of Robert I, the Duke of Normandy, and Herlever, a woman whose status as the Duke's mistress rather than his wife gave young William the less than flattering title of bastard. And if you think modern office politics are messy, medieval politics were like a Game of Thrones episode without the CGI dragons. Normandy, in the early 11th century, was a patchwork quilt of feuding nobles, each with more ambition than actual sense. It was a place where loyalty was as fleeting as a French summer, and where allegiances shifted faster than you can say feudalism. William's status as a bastard meant he was about as welcome in the upper echelons of Norman society as a cat at a dog show. But don't let the illegitimacy fool you. This kid had more grit than a sandpaper factory. When William was just 8 years old, his father decided to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Whether it was an earnest quest for spiritual enlightenment or an elaborate excuse to dodge the chaotic Norman court, we'll never know. What we do know is that Robert never made it back, leaving young William to inherit the duchy at an age when most kids today are struggling with multiplication tables. Talk about being thrown into the deep end. Now, being an 8-year-old duke might sound like a medieval version of Home Alone, but William wasn't left to fend off intruders with clever traps. Instead, he was thrust into a world of backstabbing vassals and power-hungry barons, each with their own ideas about who should really be in charge. The young duke's guardianship was like a game of musical chairs, with each guardian trying to outmaneuver the others. It was less about protecting the boy and more about who could gain the upper hand in this medieval chess game. As William grew up, he had to deal not only with the typical challenges of adolescence, but also with the very real threat of assassination. His early years were a series of close calls, betrayals, and narrow escapes that would give even the most seasoned action hero a run for their money. Yet, against all odds, William managed to survive, and by the time he hit his teenage years, he had developed a reputation for being as tough as old boots and twice as determined. But let's not paint too rosy a picture of our young duke. William wasn't just some plucky underdog battling against the odds. He was a shrewd, calculating leader who knew how to play the long game. He understood that to hold on to power in Normandy, he needed to be ruthless, and he wasn't above using a bit of medieval persuasion to keep his vassals in line. If that meant executing a few troublemakers to set an example, well, so be it. You couldn't afford to be squeamish if you want to survive as a ruler in these parts. And what about those unruly vassals? Oh, they were a colourful bunch. Imagine a medieval boardroom filled with lords whose idea of cooperation often involved swords and sieges. The Normans were known for their independent streak, and getting them to follow orders was like herding cats with a penchant for rebellion. William had to be both a diplomat and a disciplinarian, balancing the carrot and the stick with an expertise that would make Machiavelli proud. If Machiavelli had been born a few centuries earlier, that is. The chaos of Norman politics wasn't just a backdrop for William's life. It was the crucible that forged him into a leader. By the time he reached adulthood, he had learned how to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval power with a finesse that belied his origins. He had turned his status as a bastard into a badge of honor, proving that legitimacy was less about birthright and more about how much you could get done with a sword and a bit of clever maneuvering. By the mid-1040, William had firmly established himself as the Duke of Normandy. His rise to power wasn't just a personal victory. It was a testament to his ability to outsmart, outfight, and outlast his rivals. The young duke had transformed from a vulnerable child into a formidable ruler, one who would soon set his sights beyond the borders of Normandy. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of his journey so far. William's ascent wasn't just a tale of survival. It's a story of a man who turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. He played the medieval Game of Thrones with all the cunning of a chess grandmaster, proving that sometimes the best way to conquer is not by the sword alone, but with a sharp mind and an unwavering will. And as we'll see in the next chapter of his life, these qualities would serve him well when he decided that Normandy wasn't quite enough, and that maybe, just maybe, England was ripe for the taking. But that's a tale for another time, so sit tight and stay tuned for more exploits from the man who would become the Conqueror. Having transformed himself from a beleaguered child into a formidable duke, William's eyes were firmly set on the horizon, specifically the English Channel's other side. Normandy was nice and all, but England beckoned like an unsupervised cookie jar. Now, before you start picturing William as some medieval real estate agent eyeing a prime property, let's dive into the real meat of why he thought England was his for the taking. First, let's talk about the strategic genius that William was. This guy knew that to keep his vassals in line and fend off potential invaders, he needed to consolidate his power back home, and he did so with a mix of diplomacy and a healthy dose of intimidation. It was like he had a PhD in medieval power plays, managing to placate the Norman nobility while also forging alliances with neighboring regions. By the time the 1060s rolled around, William had Normandy locked down tighter than a medieval chastity belt. Now, crossing the English Channel wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a calculated move that would have made any modern strategist nod in approval. England, at the time, was experiencing its own brand of chaos. King Edward the Confessor, a ruler whose indecision could rival that of a group of friends trying to pick a restaurant, had left a mess behind when he died in January 1066. Enter Harold Godwinson, a man who grabbed the English crown faster than you can say. Succession crisis. Harold's coronation was like a surprise party nobody asked for, especially not William, who believed he had a legitimate claim to the throne. Now, why would William think he had dibs on England? Well, it all boils down to a mix of promises, politics, and maybe a bit of wishful thinking. You see, Edward the Confessor had supposedly promised William the throne years earlier. Whether this was a genuine pledge or just a throwaway line at a medieval dinner party, William took it as gospel. Plus, Harold had apparently sworn an oath to support William's claim, under duress, mind you, but an oath nonetheless. To William, this was like a signed contract, and Harold's coronation was a breach of faith worthy of a lawsuit, or, in medieval terms, an invasion. But William wasn't just banking on promises and oaths. He had a keen understanding of the economic factors at play. England was ripe for conquest, with its fertile lands and relatively stable economy. The potential for wealth was a carrot that dangled enticingly before any ambitious leader, and William was nothing if not ambitious. So, with a combination of political maneuvering and economic foresight, William began amassing the resources and allies he needed for what would become one of the most famous invasions in history. Then there's the small matter of gaining papal support. William managed to secure a papal banner from Pope Alexander Roman II, effectively getting a medieval thumbs-up for his plans. This wasn't just a spiritual blessing, it was a political masterstroke. By turning his invasion into a holy mission, William could rally more support and paint Harold as a usurper of not just his throne, but of divine will. Talk about playing the long game. As 1066 unfolded, William's preparations were as meticulous as they were ambitious. He gathered a fleet of ships and amassed an army composed of Normans, Bretons, and Flemish mercenaries. It was like assembling the Avengers of the medieval world, each soldier drawn by the promise of land, wealth, and glory. By late September, William was ready to make his move. He set sail from Normandy with his sights firmly fixed on the English coast. And what about Harold, you ask? Well, he was busy dealing with his own set of problems, namely a Norse invasion from Harald Hardrada, a king with a name that sounds like it belongs in a heavy metal band. Harold managed to defeat Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but his victory was short-lived. No sooner had he celebrated his win than word came of William's landing at Pevensey on September 28. Harold had to pull a U-turn faster than a medieval Uber driver, racing south to meet the new threat. The stage was set for what would become known as the Battle of Hastings, a clash that would change the course of English history forever. On October 14, 1066, the two armies faced off in a battle that was as brutal as it was decisive. William's forces used a mix of tactics, including feigned retreats that lured the English into breaking their lines. It was a classic bait and switch, and it worked like a charm. Now, we can't talk about the Battle of Hastings without mentioning the infamous arrow in the eye. Legend has it that Harold met his end thanks to a well-aimed arrow that struck him in the eye. While this makes for a dramatic story, the truth is likely less cinematic. Harold probably died from multiple wounds in the chaos of battle. But the arrow tale endures, a testament to the power of myth over mundane reality. With Harold dead and the English forces in disarray, William emerged victorious. His triumph at Hastings wasn't just a military win. It was the culmination of years of strategic planning, political maneuvering, and sheer determination. The conquest of England was a dream realized, but it was only the beginning of William's challenges. Conquering a land is one thing, ruling it is quite another. As William would soon discover, holding on to power in England would require all the cunning and ruthlessness he had honed in Normandy. And so, with the English crown now in his grasp, William the Conqueror began the daunting task of bringing a divided and war-torn country under his control. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The story of William's reign in England is a tale for another day, filled with intrigue, rebellion, and enough drama to fill a medieval soap opera. For now, let's leave William savouring his hard-won victory, standing on the precipice of a new chapter in his already storied life. Stay tuned, because the next part of William's saga promises to be as compelling as the last. With the dust of the Battle of Hastings barely settled, William was already eyeing the next hurdle, actually keeping the spoils of his hard-fought victory. Winning a crown on the battlefield is one thing. Keeping it perched on your head amidst the shifting sands of medieval politics is quite another. But before we delve into the post-battle chess game, let's rewind a bit to the crossing itself and the chaos that was the Battle of Hastings, where William's tactical brilliance and a dash of luck helped him pull off what many thought impossible. First, let's talk logistics. The English Channel, that 21-mile stretch of water, wasn't just a casual Sunday sail. William's fleet of about 700 ships, yes, you heard right, 700, was a floating city of soldiers, horses, and supplies. This wasn't a camping trip. It was a full-blown military caravan. The cost, astronomical. By some estimates, outfitting a single knight with horse, armor, and weapons could run between 20–40 pounds of silver, a small fortune in medieval terms. Multiply that by the thousands of men William needed, and you're talking about the kind of expenditure that could make even the most lavish of modern wedding budgets look like pocket change. And let's not forget about the soldiers themselves. William's army was a veritable United Nations of medieval Europe, with mercenaries from as far as Flanders and Brittany. These were not just hired swords. They were the medieval equivalent of free agents, drawn by the promise of land, loot, and the chance for glory. Their ranks included archers, cavalry, and foot soldiers, each playing a crucial role in the conquest to come. Crossing the Channel was a feat in itself. The fleet set sail under the cover of night, braving the unpredictable weather and the threat of storms. Picture it, hundreds of ships barbing on the choppy waters, each one packed to the gills with men and horses, all fueled by the adrenaline of impending battle. It was less a stately naval procession and more of a chaotic flotilla, with seasickness thrown in for good measure. But the gamble paid off, and William's forces landed on the English shores on September 28, 1066, ready to claim what he believed was rightfully his. Now, onto the main event, the Battle of Hastings. This wasn't some genteel chess match. It was a brutal, all-out brawl lasting from morning till dusk. The battlefield itself was a sloping hill near Hastings, and the English, led by Harold Godwinson, took the high ground. William's men had to fight uphill, a tactical disadvantage that could have spelled disaster. But here's where William's cunning came into play. His forces employed a mix of tactics, including the infamous feigned retreats. Imagine the scene, the Normans pretending to flee in panic, only to turn around and slaughter the English who broke ranks to pursue them. It was a classic bait-and switch, and it worked with deadly efficiency. The chaos of the battlefield was staggering. We're talking about an arena where communication was less about orders and more about survival. Amid the clashing swords and flying arrows, any semblance of organization quickly devolved into a melee. And let's be honest, medieval battles weren't exactly bastions of hygiene or decorum. The stench of sweat, blood, and mud, mixed with the cries of the wounded, created a scene that was more horror movie than heroic epic. Then there's the legendary tale of Harold's demise. The arrow-to-the-eye story is one for the ages, a dramatic flourish that captures the imagination. But the reality, probably not as picturesque. Harold likely fell not to a single arrow, but to the chaotic melee that ensued as the English lines crumbled. Still, the myth endures, a testament to the human penchant for storytelling over cold, hard facts. Once the dust settled, William stood victorious, but not without cost. His army had suffered, his coffers had been drained, and the English countryside was far from subdued. This was no simple coup. It was the beginning of a long and arduous task of consolidating power in a land where he was seen as an outsider. The Norman conquest, as it would come to be known, wasn't just a battle. It was a seismic shift that would reshape England's political and cultural landscape. William's victory at Hastings was just the opening salvo in a campaign that would see him crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066. But the road ahead was fraught with rebellion, dissent, and the ever-present threat of insurrection. The English nobility wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for their new ruler. Instead, they were plotting and scheming, each with their own designs on power and revenge. As William set about cementing his rule, he had to navigate the treacherous waters of English politics, a task that demanded all the cunning and ruthlessness he had honed back in Normandy. His challenge was not just to conquer, but to integrate. He had to blend Norman and English customs, law, and governance into a coherent system, all while keeping the restless English nobles in check. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. William's saga in England is just getting started, and the trials he would face in the years to come would test every ounce of his leadership and resolve. For now, let's leave our newly minted king contemplating his next move in this high-stakes Game of Thrones. There's plenty more to come in the saga of William the Conqueror, so stay tuned for the next chapter of intrigue, power struggles, and the relentless march of history. And so it begins, the tale of William's reign over England, a king not with a silver spoon, but a sword in hand, and a crown barely cool from battle. Now, if you think his path to the throne was a high-stakes chess game, ruling England was an entirely different beast. William had to turn his ragtag conquests into a stable kingdom, and for that, he turned to the medieval version of corporate restructuring, the feudal system. Feudalism, in its simplest terms, was like a pyramid scheme minus the late-night infomercials. At the top sat William, the big boss, who granted lands to his trusted barons. Think of them as medieval middle managers. In return, these barons owed him military service and loyalty, not to mention a share of their profits. Below them were the knights, the field agents of this operation, who kept the peasants, our ancient customer service reps, in check. It was a system designed to ensure everyone knew their place, and William, the ultimate micromanager, was at the helm. But let's not romanticize this. The feudal system wasn't some idyllic community of lords and vassals singing Cumbaya. It was about as fair as a rigged card game. The bulk of the population, the peasants, were tied to the land like barnacles to a ship's hull, working from sunup to sundown with little hope of advancement. Their lives were a cycle of sowing, reaping, and paying taxes, rinse and repeat. As for the Norman lords, they were learning to adapt to English weather, which, let's be honest, could make anyone question their life choices. Picture a group of Norman nobles, used to the relatively mild climate of Normandy, suddenly thrust into the English countryside, where rain is as common as complaints about the rain. It's like moving from sunny California to drizzly London without a raincoat. But William's real masterstroke was the Domesday Book, a medieval ledger so comprehensive it would make even the most detail-obsessed accountant blush. Compiled in 1086, this meticulous survey catalogued every manor, field, and pigsty in England, down to the last swine. William wasn't just counting sheep. He was taking stock of his kingdom's wealth and resources with an eye for detail rivaling a modern-day tax auditor. The Domesday Book was less a book and more a medieval spreadsheet, designed to ensure no tax penny went unaccounted for. Imagine the task. Teams of royal commissioners traipsing across England, scribbling down who owned what, and how much it was worth. It was bureaucracy at its finest, or worst, depending on your perspective. The Domesday Book was a feat of administrative genius, but also a reminder that medieval rulers had to balance swords with scribes. It was William's way of saying, I know what you've got, and I'm here to collect. Now, let's bust a myth while we're at it. The Domesday Book is often romanticized as a grand census, a noble endeavor to record the lives of medieval England. In reality, It was more about control and cash. William wanted to know exactly what his new subjects owned, so he could levy taxes accordingly. It was less about understanding and more about ensuring the royal coffers were brimming. And for those who think medieval bureaucracy was any less complex than today's, think again. The Domesday Book was a testament to the power of paperwork, long before spreadsheets were a thing. And speaking of adapting, the Normans had a few cultural hiccups to navigate. Blending Norman and English customs was like mixing oil and water, or perhaps more aptly, wine and ale. The Normans, with their refined tastes and French flair, suddenly found themselves in a land where alehouses outnumbered wine cellars. Imagine a Norman lord, with his penchant for fine wines and delicate cuisine, faced with a hearty English stew and a tankard of ale. It was a culinary culture shock that could only be smoothed over with time and a few too many pints. Then there was the matter of language. Old English and Norman French collided like two runaway carts, each trying to assert dominance. Over time, this linguistic tussle gave birth to what we now call Middle English, a mishmash that would eventually evolve into the language of Chaucer and Shakespeare. But in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, communication was an exercise in frustration. Picture a Norman noble trying to give orders to an English peasant through a series of exaggerated hand gestures and broken phrases. It was less a meeting of minds and more a comedy of errors. Economically, England was a prize worth every ounce of effort William had expended. With its fertile lands and burgeoning trade routes, the kingdom was a cash cow waiting to be milked. But economic integration was no small feat. William had to ensure that the Norman lords, many of whom were granted lands confiscated from Anglo-Saxon nobles, could manage their new estates efficiently. This meant learning the quirks of English agriculture, which was less about vineyards and more about crop rotations and livestock management. And let's not forget the rebellions. Keeping a lid on dissent was like playing medieval whack-a-mole. Every time William thought he had things under control, another revolt would pop up. From the north to the west, pockets of resistance flared like stubborn embers, refusing to die out. The most noble of these was the harrying of the north, a scorched earth campaign that left swaths of northern England devastated. It was a brutal reminder that William's rule was far from unchallenged, and that maintaining order often required more than just diplomacy. But William was nothing if not pragmatic. He knew that to truly cement his rule, he had to win the hearts and minds of his new subjects, or at least those he couldn't cow into submission. This meant granting certain concessions, marrying into influential families, and slowly integrating Norman and English nobility. It was a delicate dance, one that required the finesse of a courtier and the ruthlessness of a conqueror. As the years rolled on, William's vision of a unified England began to take shape. The feudal system, despite its flaws, provided a framework for governance, while the Domesday Book ensured a steady stream of revenue to fund William's ambitions. And while the Norman lords grumbled about the weather and the English grumbled about the Normans, a new Anglo-Norman culture was gradually emerging, a testament to the power of adaptation and compromise. So there you have it. William, the Conqueror turned king, navigating the stormy seas of medieval governance with all the cunning of a fox and the determination of a bulldog. But his story is far from over. The challenges of ruling England were only just beginning, and as we'll see in the next chapter, the weight of the crown would test William in ways even he couldn't have anticipated. Stay tuned, because the saga of William the Conqueror is as riveting as it is relentless, filled with more twists and turns than a medieval tapestry. But let's not sugarcoat it. William's reign was as much a test of endurance as it was a display of power. By the time the 1080s rolled around, he was juggling more balls than a medieval jester. Between quelling rebellions, managing a hybrid Anglo-Norman kingdom, and keeping his Norman barons from each other's throats, he had his hands full. Imagine a king, not lounging in luxury, but constantly on the move, straddling his horse like a medieval road warrior, traveling between England and Normandy. His itinerary could make a modern CEO's travel schedule look like a walk in the park. Now, onto the grand finale, William's later years, and that infamous death scene in 1087. As with many historical figures, William's end was less triumphant victory lap and more tragic opera. The legend goes that William, in his twilight years, was considerably bulkier than his younger, more svelte self. Apparently, the royal feasts had caught up with him. During a campaign in France, while laying siege to the city of Mantes, he suffered a severe abdominal injury. Some say caused by the pommel of his saddle, others suggest a nasty fall. Either way, it was the medieval equivalent of a workplace accident with no HR department to file a complaint. William was carted off to Rouen, where he spent his final weeks in agony. The man who had once been a force of nature was now bedridden, his empire's fate hanging in the balance. His deathbed scene was about as chaotic as you'd expect. His sons were already squabbling over his legacy like kids fighting over the remote control. William Rufus, his second son, was handed England, while his eldest, Robert Curthose, got Normandy. The third son, Henry, was left with a hardy good luck and a chest of silver. It was a classic case of medieval favoritism, wrapped in the veneer of strategic planning. And then comes the moment of chaos that would define his burial. Upon William's death on September 9, 1087, things went off the rails like a runaway cart. His attendants, presumably checking their job security, deserted him faster than you can say severance package. His body was left unattended, a far cry from the grand funerals typical of a king. Eventually he was buried in Keene, but not without a final bizarre twist. The church was too small for his unusually large body, and in the process of forcing him into the grave, the corpse reportedly burst. It's a scene straight out of a dark comedy, a far cry from the dignified end one might expect for a king. As for his legacy, William's impact was as complex as the man himself. He was a paradox, both a unifier and a divider, a builder and a destroyer. He transformed England, but not without leaving scars that would take generations to heal. The Norman conquest had reshaped the land, but it also planted seeds of tension between Normans and Anglo-Saxons that would linger like a bad smell. The English aristocracy was effectively replaced, with lands and titles redistributed to William's loyal followers. It was a seismic shift, one that echoed through the corridors of power for centuries. William's reign also saw the introduction of the feudal system, a social structure that, while hierarchical, was surprisingly elastic. It allowed for a degree of upward mobility, if you knew how to play your cards right. Yet, it also entrenched a society where the peasants were little more than serfs, tied to the land and at the mercy of their lords. Economically, England thrived under the Normans, with new trade routes and agricultural practices boosting the kingdom's wealth. But let's be honest, most of that wealth filtered upwards, leaving the average peasant's life as grim as a medieval winter. And then there's the matter of the myths. William has been portrayed as both a tyrant and a visionary, a conqueror with a crown and a heavy hand. The reality is, as always, a bit grayer. Yes, he was ruthless. His scorched earth tactics in the north were brutal, even by medieval standards. But he was also a man of his time, navigating the cutthroat politics of the era with a mix of pragmatism and force. The romanticized tales of chivalric conquest gloss over the harsh realities of medieval warfare and governance. But they persist because, well, we love a good story. In the end, William's legacy is like a tapestry, woven with threads of conquest, governance, and myth. He left an indelible mark on England, one that would shape the nation's history long after his bones had turned to dust. The Domesday Book remains a testament to his administrative genius, while his feudal system laid the groundwork for centuries of English governance. His story is a reminder that history is never black and white. It's a complex dance of power, politics, and personality. So, as the curtain falls on the saga of William the Conqueror, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of his life. From the bastard son of Normandy to the King of England, his journey was nothing short of epic. He played the medieval Game of Thrones with all the cunning of a grandmaster, proving that sometimes the best way to conquer is with a mix of might, mind, and a little bit of luck. And as we bid farewell to our intrepid conqueror, let's remember the lessons of his life. That power is fleeting, that legacy is a double-edged sword, and that history is always more nuanced than the myths we create. Michelangelo's story kicks off in Capri, a small Tuscan town that's about as bustling as a library on a Friday night, where he was born on March 6, 1475. If you've ever been to Capri, you'd know it's not exactly Florence or Rome. But hey, even geniuses have to start somewhere, right? His father, Lodovico Buonarroti, was a local government official with more ambition than actual power. Think of him as the guy at the municipal office who dreams of being mayor, but ends up settling disputes over chickens. The Buonarroti family wasn't rolling in florins. In fact, they were about as financially secure as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. Lodovico was a bit of a gambler, not in the rolling dice kind of way, but in the let's hope this job pays off sense. The family fortunes were as erratic as Italian weather, sunny one minute, stormy the next. This financial instability was a big reason why Michelangelo, rather than being pampered like a Renaissance Kardashian, found himself in Florence at the tender age of 13. Florence, the throbbing heart of the Renaissance, was a world away from sleepy Capri. This was a city where art wasn't just appreciated, it was a competitive sport. Michelangelo was thrown into this artistic gladiatorial arena when he became the apprentice of Domenico Ghirlandaio in 1488. Now, Ghirlandaio was no slouch. He was a leading painter in Florence, and getting an apprenticeship with him was like landing an internship at Apple, minus the free coffee and corporate jargon. The romanticized tales of Michelangelo's genius often paint him as a divine prodigy, chiseling masterpieces straight out of the womb. The reality, not so much. He had to learn the ropes like everyone else, starting with the art of mixing paints and prepping canvases. Imagine the young Michelangelo, not yet the brooding sculptor of later fame, but a teenage boy probably getting more pigment on his face than on the walls. Ghirlandaio's workshop was a bustling place. It was here that Michelangelo learned the practical skills that would serve as the foundation of his illustrious career. But let's not get carried away. There were no angels descending from the heavens to whisper secrets of sculpture in his ear. He was gifted, sure, but he was also a student, one who had to deal with the mundane realities of learning the craft, including the ever-present smell of linseed oil and the constant scraping of brushes. One of the more amusing anecdotes from his apprenticeship involves Michelangelo sneakily copying one of Ghirlandaio's drawings and passing it off as his own. This little escapade showed not only his budding talent, but also a hint of the cheeky audacity that would become a hallmark of his career. When Ghirlandaio found out, he was more amused than angry, probably because he saw a bit of himself in the young artist. Despite the romantic notion that Michelangelo was some lone wolf genius, his early years were marked by collaboration and learning. He was part of a vibrant artistic community where ideas were exchanged as frequently as gossip in a small town. This environment was crucial for his development, providing him with the skills and inspiration that would later see him sculpting the likes of David and painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's worth noting that Michelangelo's first known commission at the age of 21 was a statue of Hercules for the Medici family, Florence's de facto rulers. The Medici were the ultimate patrons, the Renaissance equivalent of modern-day tech billionaires funding moonshot projects. They recognized Michelangelo's potential and put him to work, a decision that would pay off handsomely as his career skyrocketed. But let's not gloss over the fact that being a Renaissance artist wasn't all about glory and grandeur. It was hard work, and the competition was fierce. Michelangelo had to prove himself constantly, battling not just for commissions but for recognition. In an era where art was both a calling and a cutthroat business, the stakes were high and the pressure was relentless. So, as we delve into Michelangelo's early life, it's clear that his journey was neither a straight path to greatness nor a series of miraculous strokes of genius. Instead, it was a combination of talent, tenacity, and a fair bit of luck. The young artist from Capri had stepped into the world's stage, ready to carve out his destiny one marble block at a time. And just like that, the legend of Michelangelo began to take shape. But let's not forget that it all started with a young boy in a small town, dreaming big amidst the chaos of Renaissance Florence. And so, from the rustic backdrops of Capri and the bustling workshops of Florence, Michelangelo found himself on a path that would lead him to Rome, the beating heart of the Renaissance's political and cultural maelstrom. Rome in 1498 was not exactly a serene oasis of art appreciation. It was the epicenter of papal politics, a city where cardinals wielded power like medieval CEOs, and art commissions were handed out with a mix of divine inspiration and Machiavellian scheming. This is where our young sculptor would make his mark with the Pieta, a masterpiece that would catapult him into the stratosphere of Renaissance fame, even as it exposed the bizarre economics of art in his day. The Pieta, for those not fluent in the language of art history, is a sculpture that depicts the Virgin Mary cradling the dead body of Jesus. Michelangelo was just 23 when he took on this commission from French Cardinal Jean de Bilhers. Imagine being handed the keys to a Ferrari when you've just got your driver's license. It was a monumental task, one that promised to either cement his reputation or shatter his budding career. But why Rome, and why this commission? Well, the Eternal City was the Silicon Valley of the Renaissance, a place where the ambitious came to make their fortunes or lose them trying. And Michelangelo, ever the opportunist, knew that a successful gig in Rome would be worth its weight in marble. Speaking of marble, let's talk about the absurdity of art commissions and their costs. The Pieta was carved from a single block of Carrara marble, which in those days was a bit like the iPhone of sculpting materials, incredibly desirable and eye-wateringly expensive. We're talking about a price tag that could feed a small village for a year. The fact that Michelangelo managed to convince his patrons to cough up the cash speaks to both his talent and his burgeoning reputation as a bit of a Renaissance diva. He was, after all, the kind of artist who would later famously refuse to take a bath because he was too busy working. Talk about dedication to the craft. The Pieta was completed in less than 2 years, a Herculean feat considering its size and detail. When unveiled, it was an immediate sensation. People flocked to see this marble miracle, and Michelangelo's name was on everyone's lips. But here's the kicker. Despite the sculpture's serene beauty, Michelangelo had the audacity to carve his name across Mary's sash, a bold move that was unheard of at the time. It was like Banksy signing his street art in neon lights. This was the moment when Michelangelo's reputation as both a genius and a shameless self-promoter began to take shape. He wasn't just selling art, he was selling himself. Now, let's dig into the economic and political landscape of Rome at the time. The city was a swirling cocktail of wealth and poverty, power and corruption. The papacy was as much a political entity as a spiritual one, with popes acting more like kings than shepherds of the faithful. Art was not merely decoration, but a tool of propaganda, used to convey the power and piety of whoever commissioned it. This was a world where a well-placed fresco could do more for a cardinal's career than 1,000 sermons. Michelangelo knew how to navigate these treacherous waters, leveraging his talent to secure commissions that would keep him in the lavish lifestyle he was quickly becoming accustomed to, or at least as lavish as a man who preferred chisels to chamber parts could be. In this environment, the cost of art was less about the materials and more about the status it conferred. Michelangelo's Pieta wasn't just a religious icon. It was a statement of power, a declaration that the patron who commissioned it was a true mover and shaker in the cutthroat world of Renaissance Rome. The economics of art were as complex as they were lucrative, and Michelangelo played the game like a seasoned pro. He understood that in a city where appearances were everything, being the artist behind the most talked-about sculpture was a ticket to the big leagues. But let's not romanticize it too much. The reality was that artists like Michelangelo were often at the mercy of their patrons, who could be as fickle as Italian weather. Commissions could be revoked at a whim, payments delayed, and reputations tarnished by even the slightest hint of scandal. And yet, Michelangelo managed to thrive, his work becoming synonymous with the height of Renaissance achievement. He was a man who straddled two worlds, the divine and the profane, the exalted and the earthy. His genius lay not just in his ability to carve marble, but in his understanding of human nature and the power of art to move, inspire, and manipulate. As Michelangelo's star rose, so did his reputation for being, well, a bit difficult. Stories of his temper and stubbornness abound, painting a picture of an artist who was as uncompromising as he was brilliant. He was known to destroy his own work if it didn't meet his exacting standards, a perfectionism that bordered on obsession. This intensity, while contributing to his legend, also made him a challenging figure to work with. Yet somehow, it only added to his allure. In the world of Renaissance art, where divas were a dime a dozen, Michelangelo was the diva to end all divas. So here we have Michelangelo, the man who carved the Pieta, and in doing so, carved out a place for himself in the annals of art history. His breakthrough in Rome was not just a personal triumph, but a testament to the power of art to transcend the mundane and touch the divine. Yet, beneath the marble and the myth, he remained a man of his time, ambitious, flawed, and fiercely human. As we continue to follow his journey, remember that this is only the beginning. Michelangelo's story, like his sculptures, is layered and complex, a testament to the enduring power of genius to shape the world. And with his reputation cemented, both literally and figuratively, Michelangelo was ready to tackle even greater challenges, leaving us to wonder what marvels he would create next in this tumultuous, awe-inspiring era. With his reputation firmly chiseled into the annals of history, Michelangelo found himself on the doorstep of yet another audacious project, the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Picture this. It's 1508, and Pope Julius Roman II, a man whose ambitions were as grand as his papal tiara, decided that the chapel's rather uninspiring starry sky ceiling needed a makeover. A simple task, right? Just slap a few coats of paint and call it a day. But Julius wanted more, a lot more. He envisioned biblical scenes sprawling across the ceiling like the Renaissance's version of an IMAX movie. Enter Michelangelo, who, despite his sculptor's soul, was handed the brush rather than the chisel. The artist was less than thrilled. Painting wasn't his forte, and frescoes, well, those were a whole different beast. But when the Pope calls, you answer, even if the call is more of a demand. So, Michelangelo reluctantly traded his marble blocks for scaffolding, setting the stage for one of the most iconic art undertakings in history. Now, let's talk logistics. Michelangelo didn't just slap some ladders against the chapel walls and hope for the best. No, this was a project that required engineering genius. He designed a custom scaffolding system that attached to the walls and allowed him to work on the ceiling without leaving gaping holes in the chapel floor. It's like he invented the Renaissance version of a cherry picker. This was no small feat. The Sistine Chapel stretches about 40 meters, 131 feet, long, and 13 meters, 43 feet, wide. Imagine trying to paint a canvas that size while balancing on a narrow plank. Now there's a gymnastic routine for the ages. And let's debunk one of the most persistent myths. Michelangelo didn't paint lying on his back. Nope, that romantic image of him flat on his back, brush in hand, is as fictional as a unicorn riding a bicycle. He painted standing up, craning his neck at awkward angles that would make a yoga instructor wince. The physical toll was immense. Michelangelo reportedly wrote a poem complaining about his hunched posture and strained neck, likening his experience to that of a barber shaving a ceiling. His eyesight suffered too, his vision reportedly blurred from the constant upward gaze. So much for the glamorous life of an artist. But what about the paint? This wasn't your run-of-the-mill emulsion. Fresco painting involves applying water-based pigments and a freshly laid wet plaster. The trick is to work fast before the plaster dries, a challenge that even the most caffeinated of painters would find intimidating. Michelangelo had to mix his pigments himself, a process that involved grinding minerals and mixing them with water. No wonder he preferred the steady permanence of marble carving over the ephemeral race against drying plaster. Now, imagine the pressure. A pope with an eye on the clock and a budget tighter than a corset. Julius Roman II wasn't exactly known for his patience. He wanted results, and he wanted them fast. Michelangelo was given 4 years to complete the ceiling, a Herculean task considering the sheer scale and complexity of the work. This wasn't just about painting pretty pictures. It was about creating a visual narrative that spanned the creation of the world to the story of Noah. Each scene had to be meticulously planned, sketched, and executed with precision. The budget was another beast entirely. Pope Julius Roman II coffers were not bottomless, and the Sistine Chapel project was competing for funds with the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. Michelangelo had to work within these constraints, often stretching resources to their limits. The cost of materials, labor, and time all added up, making this not just a creative endeavor, but a financial balancing act. Yet somehow, Michelangelo managed to keep the project afloat, proving that he was as much a savvy project manager as he was an artist. Despite the grandeur of the final product, the work was far from glamorous. The Sistine Chapel was a construction site, filled with the noise of workers, the smell of wet plaster, and the ever-present dust that clung to everything like an unwelcome guest. Michelangelo labored under these conditions, driven by a mix of inspiration, obligation, and a touch of stubborn pride. He was a man who understood that art wasn't just about beauty. It was about endurance, resilience, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. As the years passed, the chapel began to take shape. The scenes on the ceiling came alive with the vibrancy and dynamism that would come to define Michelangelo's work. Yet, for all its beauty, the process was anything but serene. The artist battled fatigue, frustration, and the looming deadlines that hung over him like the sword of Damocles. It was a test of human endurance as much as artistic skill, a testament to the lengths one man would go to fulfill a vision that was as demanding as it was divine. In the end, the Sistine Chapel ceiling became a masterpiece not just of art, but of human perseverance. It stands as a reminder that behind every great work of art is a story of grit, struggle, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Michelangelo, through sheer force of will and a fair bit of artistic genius, transformed the chapel into a canvas that captured the imagination of the world. But let's not forget the man behind the myth, a man who faced the physical and mental demands of his craft with a resolve that was as unyielding as the marble he loved to sculpt. As we leave Michelangelo suspended between the heavens and the earth, brush in hand, remember that this is only part of his story. The Sistine Chapel ceiling was both a pinnacle and a prelude, a testament to his genius and a glimpse of the challenges yet to come. Michelangelo was a man who defied the limits of his time, and in doing so left a legacy that continues to inspire and awe generations. But the tale is far from over, and as we continue to unravel the threads of his life, we'll discover even more about the artist, the icon, and the man who dared to paint the sky. As Michelangelo descended from the dizzying heights of the Sistine Chapel, he was thrust back into the tumultuous world of Renaissance politics and art, where his chisels would once again take center stage. Fast forward to the 1520, and we find our revered artist in Florence, grappling with the Medici family, because if there's one thing more challenging than painting a ceiling, it's dealing with the Medici. Let's lay the groundwork here. Florence was in a state of political whiplash, with the Medici being exiled and reinstated more times than a Netflix show renewal. By the early 16th century, they were back in power, and they had plans to make Florence the cultural epicenter of the universe. Enter the Medici Chapel, an ambitious project designed to house the tombs of Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother Giuliano. Who better to immortalize these titans of Renaissance Italy than Michelangelo, the rock star of sculpting? Now, working with the Medici was like being on a roller coaster, lots of ups and downs, and if you're not careful, you might end up losing your lunch, or worse, your head. Michelangelo's relationship with his patrons was as rocky as the marble he worked with. The Medici wanted grandeur. Michelangelo wanted artistic freedom. Spoiler alert, they didn't always see eye to eye. The Medici Chapel was not just about artistry, but about power and propaganda. The Medici wanted to send a message that their dynasty was as eternal as the statues that would guard their tombs. Michelangelo was tasked with creating sculptures that would embody the virtues and grandeur of the Medici rule. These weren't just any tombs. They were statements in stone, a Renaissance version of a PR campaign, and Michelangelo was the creative director. But as with any project of this scale, economic pressures were a constant headache. The Medici were wealthy, but even their coffers had limits, especially when they had a city to run and a family legacy to maintain. Michelangelo had to balance his artistic vision with the practical realities of limited resources and time constraints. It was a bit like being asked to sculpt the perfect statue with one hand tied behind your back and a clock ticking ominously in the background. Despite these pressures, Michelangelo delivered works that were nothing short of revolutionary. His statues of dusk and dawn, night and day, were not just funeral monuments, but profound meditations on the passage of time and the human condition. They reflected the turbulent politics of Florence, a city that was constantly reinventing itself amidst chaos and uncertainty. Michelangelo's genius lay in his ability to infuse cold marble with the warmth of human emotion and the complexity of life's fleeting nature. Yet, the project was fraught with delays and disagreements. Michelangelo's perfectionism clashed with the Medici's impatience, leading to a strained relationship that was as contentious as it was creative. It's a wonder they didn't install a revolving door in the chapel for all the arguments and reconciliations. But as much as they butted heads, the Medici knew that Michelangelo's talent was worth the headaches and the hefty price tag. And speaking of price tags, let's not forget the economic context. Italy during this period was a patchwork of city-states, each vying for dominance. Art was both a cultural and economic investment, a means of projecting power and prestige. The Medici understood this all too well, using art to bolster their political standing. Michelangelo, ever the savvy operator, knew how to navigate these waters, securing commissions that kept him in demand even as political tides shifted. But hold onto your paintbrushes, because Florence wasn't the only stage for Michelangelo's later years. In 1534, he was summoned back to Rome by Pope Clement Roman VII, another Medici, because apparently one can never have too many Medici patrons. The task: paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. If the ceiling was Michelangelo's magnum opus, the Last Judgment was its apocalyptic encore. The scene was set: a time of religious upheaval with the Protestant Reformation sweeping across Europe like a theological tsunami. The Catholic Church was in full damage control mode, using art to reaffirm its authority and counter the reformist wave. The Last Judgment was not just a fresco, it was a visual manifesto, a declaration of faith and power. Michelangelo, now in his 60s, approached the project with the vigor of a man half his age, but with the wisdom of a seasoned maestro. This wasn't just about depicting the end of days in vivid color. It was about capturing the existential angst of a world on the brink of transformation. The fresco was a chaotic symphony of souls, angels, and demons, a reminder of the eternal struggle between salvation and damnation. It was a reflection of an era where the stakes were higher than ever, both spiritually and politically. And let's not sugarcoat it. The Last Judgment stirred up more controversy than a Renaissance tabloid. There was the nudity, for starters, which had some clerics clutching their rosaries in horror. Michelangelo's decision to depict figures au natural was both an artistic statement and a theological one, challenging the Church's rigid norms. Critics accused him of immorality, with one cardinal even commissioning another artist to paint over the offending bits, a Renaissance version of censorship. But Michelangelo was no stranger to controversy. He thrived on it, using his art to challenge conventions and provoke thought. The Last Judgment was his boldest statement yet, a testament to his belief that art should be as challenging as it is beautiful. It was a project that pushed him to his limits, both creatively and physically, yet it cemented his legacy as one of history's most daring artists. As Michelangelo's life drew to a close, he remained a towering figure in the world of art and politics. His later years were marked by a profound introspection, as he grappled with the weight of his achievements and the fleeting nature of existence. He was a man who had carved his name into the annals of history, yet he was acutely aware of the impermanence of it all. Michelangelo's story is one of genius and grit, of a man who defied the constraints of his time to create works that continue to captivate and inspire. His legacy is not just in the marble and frescoes he left behind, but in the enduring impact of his vision, a vision that transcends the ages, challenging us to see the world through his eyes. But remember, we're not done yet. Michelangelo's journey is a testament to the power of art to transcend the ordinary and touch the divine. And as we continue to explore his life, we'll uncover even more about the man, the myth, and the legend. Stay tuned, because the story of Michelangelo is far from over, and the final chapter promises to be just as enthralling as the rest. Michelangelo's journey nears its end, and what a ride it's been. After a lifetime of creating wonders, Michelangelo found himself facing his final years with the same intensity that marked his entire career. By the time he reached his late 70s, he was still chiseling away at blocks of marble, as if time itself had no hold over him. And perhaps it didn't, at least not in the way it does for us mere mortals, because Michelangelo had something else in mind: legacy. Let's talk about the myth-making around Michelangelo's persona. His reputation as a tortured genius who could sculpt a god from a lump of rock was cultivated not just by his remarkable body of work, but also by the stories that swirled around him like Renaissance gossip on steroids. We're talking tales of him sleeping in his clothes, refusing to bathe, and destroying completed works that didn't meet his sky-high standards. These stories paint a picture of an artist consumed by his craft, a man who saw art as both a calling and a curse. And while there's truth to these tales, they also serve to romanticize the harsh realities of his life. But was Michelangelo really the lone genius, chiseling away in solitary brilliance? Not quite. He was part of a vibrant community of artists and thinkers, participating in the exchange of ideas that defined the Renaissance. Sure, he might not have been the life of the party, but he wasn't a hermit either. His collaboration with other artists, architects and thinkers played a crucial role in shaping his work and his legacy. The myth of the solitary genius is just that, a myth. In reality, Michelangelo was a master of networking, leveraging his connections to secure commissions and navigate the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics. Now, let's dive into the evolution of the art market during Michelangelo's time, which was as turbulent as the Tiber during a storm. The Renaissance was an era where art and money danced a complicated tango, and Michelangelo was right in the middle of it. Art was no longer just about religious devotion or decoration. It was an investment, a status symbol, and a political tool. Patrons like the Medici and the popes understood the power of art to convey prestige and influence, which meant that artists like Michelangelo were in high demand. But with demand came competition, and Michelangelo had to continually prove his worth. His ability to command high prices for his work was not just a testament to his talent, but also to his savvy understanding of the market. He knew how to position himself as both an artist and a brand, a Renaissance rock star whose works were as much about the man behind them as the art itself. And here's the kicker. Michelangelo's fame skyrocketed even more after his death. In 1564, when he finally put down his chisel for the last time at the age of 88, he left behind a legacy that would resonate through the ages. His works became the gold standard of artistic achievement, and his name became synonymous with genius. Posthumously, Michelangelo was elevated to near-mythical status, his life and works scrutinized and celebrated like those of a celebrity. The art market continued to evolve, and Michelangelo's pieces became prized possessions, fetching astronomical sums that would have made even his most ambitious patrons do a double take. So, how much of Michelangelo's story is legend, and how much is reality? The truth lies somewhere in between. The reality is that Michelangelo was a man of his time, shaped by the social, political, and economic forces of the Renaissance. His genius was undeniable, but it was also the product of a lifetime of learning, collaboration, and relentless pursuit of perfection. The myth, on the other hand, offers us a romanticized vision of an artist who defied the odds to create beauty in a world that was often anything but. As we wrap up Michelangelo's story, it's essential to reflect on his impact on future generations. His works have inspired countless artists, architects, and thinkers, from the Baroque masters to the modernists. He set a standard of artistic excellence that continues to challenge and inspire, reminding us that art is not just about technique, but about the ability to capture the human experience in all its complexity. Michelangelo's legacy is a testament to the enduring power of art to transcend time and space. His sculptures and paintings are not just relics of the past, but living dialogues with the present, inviting us to see the world through his eyes. And while the myths surrounding his life add a layer of intrigue and romance, it's the reality of his achievements that truly resonates. Michelangelo was a man who dared to dream big and carve those dreams into the very fabric of history. So, as you drift off to sleep with visions of marble angels and painted heavens, remember the man behind the myth. Michelangelo was not just a creator of masterpieces, but a relentless seeker of truth and beauty. His story, like his art, is a rich tapestry of genius, ambition, and the eternal human quest to leave a mark on the world. And in that quest, Michelangelo succeeded beyond measure, proving that true greatness lies not in the myths we create, but in the legacy we leave behind. In ancient Egypt, the gods weren't just a divine roll call. They were the original cast of a celestial drama that could rival any modern-day soap opera. Picture Ra, the sun god, not just lighting up the skies, but also doubling as the universe's most reliable alarm clock. You could say he was the original solar power, clocking in with a 24/7 work schedule to ensure the sun rose, and set with military precision. Now, Ra wasn't just about punctuality. He was a big deal, the headliner in a pantheon that was as crowded as a New York subway at rush hour. He was the ultimate authority, the CEO of the cosmos, and guess what? His job security was pretty solid since, well, who needs a performance review when you're the sun? But Ra's reign wasn't without its office politics. Enter Osiris, the god of the afterlife, agriculture, and those slightly awkward get-togethers known as Judgment Days. Osiris had a gig that was both revered and feared. His role was to weigh the hearts of the deceased against the feather of Mad, the goddess of truth. Talk about pressure. If your heart was heavier, well, let's just say your afterlife plans got a bit more complicated. Osiris' popularity soared, especially among the common folk, because who wouldn't want a god who threw in a good word for their eternal soul? Then there was Isis, the goddess of magic and motherhood, the ancient world's multitasker. She wasn't just Osiris' wife. She was a bona fide goddess of many talents. Think of her as the original influencer, revered and followed by everyone from pharaohs to farmers. Her story was one of love and resilience. She famously reassembled Osiris after he was dismembered by his own brother, Set. That's right, sibling rivalry at its deadliest. Set, the god of chaos, played the role of the pantheon's troublemaker, always stirring the pot with betrayals and a penchant for power grabs. Now, here's where the myth-busting begins. These gods weren't the paragons of perfection we often imagine. Not unlike today's rock stars, they had their scandals, rivalries, and downright bizarre situations. Take Horus, the hawk-headed god who was constantly in a feud with Set. Their battles were less Clash of the Titans and more family feud, deity edition. Horus even lost an eye in one of their epic showdowns, which was later restored by Thoth, the god of wisdom and riding, showing that even gods needed a little help now and then. The stories of these deities were not just tales, but tools of governance. The pharaohs, those divine rulers of Egypt, knew a good marketing strategy when they saw one. They used these stories, often depicted in hieroglyphs, to reinforce their own godlike status. It was like an ancient PR campaign, with temples and tombs serving as billboards proclaiming the pharaoh's divine right to rule. And believe me, when your political legitimacy is a gift from the gods, it's much harder for your subjects to stage an uprising. Hieroglyphs, the emoji of ancient Egypt, were vital in this celestial marketing scheme. They weren't just pretty pictures, they were powerful symbols that communicated complex ideas and legitimized the rule of the pharaohs. Inscriptions would often show pharaohs hobnobbing with gods, emphasizing their divine connections. It was a bit like those celebrity endorsement deals today, except instead of sneakers or cologne, it was the entire country they were selling. These divine narratives also helped maintain social order. The gods were marketed in a way that made them relatable yet untouchable. This duality kept the public in awe and fear, ensuring they adhered to societal norms. After all, nothing says behave quite like the threat of a godly curse or the promise of eternal paradise. So why did these stories matter? Because they were the backbone of ancient Egyptian society. They shaped the values, laws, and customs of an entire civilization. The gods were more than mythological figures. They were integral to Egypt's identity, influencing everything from architecture to art, and even politics. They were the glue that held the society together, providing comfort, structure, and a sense of purpose in a world that was as unpredictable as the Nile's flooding. In the end, the gods of ancient Egypt were not just divine beings to be worshipped, but characters in an unfolding story that mirrored the complexities of human existence. Their tales of love, betrayal, and redemption were timeless, resonating with audiences then and now. Through their stories, the Egyptians found meaning, order, and a little bit of magic in their everyday lives. And let's be honest, who doesn't need a little magic every now and then? Let's trade the divine spotlight for some earthly logistics and dive into the everyday grind of ancient Egyptian rituals. Picture a world where temples weren't just spiritual sanctuaries, but bustling hubs of economic activity. You see, keeping the gods happy wasn't cheap. The Egyptians didn't just toss a few coins in the cosmic collection plate and call it a day. Nope, they went all out, spending what today would be millions annually to ensure the temples were as pristine as a pharaoh's palace. The daily temple routines were a blend of religious devotion and meticulous project management. Imagine priests waking up before dawn, not for a morning jog, but to scrub statues of deities with natron, a type of baking soda on divine steroids. They then dressed these statues in the finest linens, which were replaced daily. Talk about high maintenance. And just like that, a new day of offerings began, featuring everything from bread and beer to incense and livestock. Each offering was a transaction in the spiritual marketplace, ensuring the gods stayed on Egypt's good side. But why all this effort, you ask? Well, in ancient Egypt, keeping the gods content was like having a VIP pass to stability and prosperity. The pharaohs understood this all too well. Their rule was divinely sanctioned, after all, and a temple's success was directly linked to their own political strength. This wasn't just about spirituality. It was about power and influence. The priests were the middlemen, the celebrity influencers of their time. With their elaborate rituals and insider access to the gods, they wielded significant clout, often rivaling that of the pharaohs themselves. Let's talk logistics. Each temple functioned like a complex corporation. For instance, the Temple of Ammon at Karnak, one of the largest religious complexes in the world, employed thousands. It was an economic behemoth with vast agricultural lands, workshops, and fleets of ships. These temples didn't just run on divine goodwill. They had their own revenue streams, producing goods and trading them across the empire. It's as if each temple had its own mini-economy, with priests acting as both spiritual leaders and savvy businessmen. Now, here's the kicker, the staggering costs. Maintaining these temples was no small feat. Think of the equivalent of millions of dollars annually. The Temple of Ammon alone held a staggering 1/6 of Egypt's arable land. Imagine the logistical headache of managing that. That's not even mentioning the manpower needed. Those daily rituals, they required an army of workers, from priests to craftsmen to laborers. The temples were Egypt's biggest employers, and their upkeep was a full-scale operation. But let's not get too swept away by the grandeur. Beneath the surface, these rituals were less about divine devotion and more about social order. Temples were the epicenter of community life, reinforcing the societal hierarchy. The priests, in their lavish robes, represented the pinnacle of social status. They were the arbiters of divine will, interpreting the gods' desires, which conveniently aligned with maintaining the status quo. In this way, rituals became tools of governance, ensuring everyone knew their place in the cosmic and societal order. And let's not forget the grandiose ceremonies that punctuated the Egyptians' calendar. The Apit Festival, for instance, was a yearly extravaganza that would make any modern-day parade look like a neighborhood picnic. It was all about renewing the pharaoh's divine mandate. Picture processions with golden barges, priests chanting hymns, and the entire city coming to a standstill to witness the spectacle. These ceremonies weren't just religious obligations. They were political theater, designed to awe the masses and reaffirm the pharaoh's God-given right to rule. So, while the temple rituals of ancient Egypt might seem like a spiritual Disneyland, they were, in reality, a finely tuned machine designed to keep the societal gears turning smoothly. The gods got their offerings, the pharaohs their legitimacy, and the people their place in the grand scheme of things. It was a system that balanced faith with practicality, ensuring that both realms were satisfied. And let's face it, in a world as unpredictable as ancient Egypt, having the gods on your side was the ultimate insurance policy. Speaking of having the gods on your side, let's dive into the afterlife game, where stakes were high, and the ultimate prize was immortality. The ancient Egyptians weren't just building pyramids for the aesthetic. They were crafting elaborate launch pads for the soul's cosmic journey. Picture this, a multi-step travel itinerary that included mummification, a guidebook known as the Book of the Dead, and finally, a pit stop at the court of Osiris. It's safe to say, securing eternal life was about as simple as assembling IKEA furniture without instructions. Now, mummification, the cornerstone of Egyptian funerary practices, was more than just an embalming process. It was an art form, and a complicated one at that. It took about 70 days to transform the dearly departed into a mummy fit for eternity. The ancient embalmers were like the original morticians, and had a knack for detail that would put any modern-day perfectionist to shame. They didn't just wrap a body in linen and call it a day. No, they removed organs, dried the body with natron, that magical baking soda again, and packed it with resins and spices. The brain, Extracted through the nose, of course. Why keep something you didn't need in the afterlife, right? The economic toll of this process was significant. Mummification wasn't cheap. It was a luxury reserved for those with enough wealth to afford it. We're talking about a price tag that, in today's money, could range from a modest funeral to something akin to a small luxury car. And it wasn't just the embalming. The burial had to be spectacular too, complete with ornate coffins, intricate jewelry, and a tomb stocked with everything a soul might need in the great beyond, from food to furniture. This wasn't just about honoring the dead, it was a social statement. The more elaborate the tomb, the more prestige left behind for the living. Enter the Book of the Dead, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a Lonely Planet guide to the afterlife. This wasn't a single book, but rather a collection of spells, charms, and maps designed to navigate the treacherous underworld. It was essentially a cheat sheet for surviving the trials and tribulations of the afterlife, including the infamous weighing of the heart. If your heart was lighter than the feather of Mad, you got a golden ticket to the field of reeds, a paradise where the beer flowed and the bread was always fresh. If not, well, let's just say your afterlife accommodations were less than 5-star. But here's where the myth-busting comes in. For all their grandeur and promise, these afterlife preparations were less about spiritual readiness and more about political messaging. The pharaohs, with their grand tombs and lavish funerals, were playing a game of divine PR. Immortality was the ultimate brand promise, and by securing a luxurious spot in eternity, they kept their subjects invested in their rule. After all, if the pharaoh could guarantee his own eternal life, maybe he could ensure their prosperity in this one. However, the allure of eternal paradise often collided with a stark reality: grave robbing. The Valley of the Kings, home to the most opulent of tombs, became a hotspot for thieves looking to cash in on the afterlife's riches. Tomb robbery was so rampant that even the most secure resting places were looted within a few generations. The treasures meant to accompany the dead into eternity often found their way into the pockets of the living. It was a harsh reminder that while the pharaohs might have dreamed of eternal glory, their treasures were often more valuable to those struggling to make ends meet. These grave goods were more than just trinkets. They represented a significant economic burden. The resources poured into these tombs could have funded public works or fed the hungry, but instead they were locked away in the pursuit of immortality. It's a classic tale of misallocated priorities, where the quest for eternal life overshadowed the needs of the living. The pharaohs might have been trying to secure their divine legacy, but in the process, they often left their successors with empty coffers and a populace less enchanted by promises of eternal paradise. The famous tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered almost untouched by Howard Carter in 1922, is a testament to the sheer scale of these funerary excesses. The young pharaoh's tomb was packed with treasures, from golden chariots to jewelry of unmatched craftsmanship. Yet, Tutankhamun's reign was relatively unremarkable, suggesting that the grandeur of a tomb wasn't always a reflection of a ruler's accomplishments, but rather a show of wealth and power. The discovery of his tomb reignited the world's fascination with ancient Egypt, but it also highlighted the economic disparities of the time. Meanwhile, back in the land of the living, the economic strain of funding these afterlife endeavors was felt across the kingdom. As much as the pharaohs wanted their subjects to buy into the dream of an eternal paradise, the reality was that many couldn't afford the luxury of elaborate funerary rites. For the average Egyptian, the afterlife was a more modest affair, often relying on family members to perform rituals and provide offerings. It was a system where wealth dictated your eternal prospects, a poignant reminder that even in death, social hierarchies persisted. So, while the myths of eternal paradise and cursed treasures continue to captivate our imaginations, the truth is far more complex. The ancient Egyptians' obsession with the afterlife was as much about maintaining power and control as it was about spiritual fulfillment. Their funerary practices were a blend of genuine belief and political theater, designed to keep the wheels of society turning. In a world where the line between the divine and the earthly was blurred, the pursuit of immortality was both a personal journey and a public spectacle. As we unravel these layers of history, it's clear that the ancient Egyptians were masters of dual narratives. They sold the dream of eternal life while grappling with the economic and social realities of their time. And as we look back at their world, we're reminded that the stories we tell about life, death, and what comes after are as much about the living as they are about the deceased. So, let's keep pulling at these threads, because there's more to uncover in this tapestry of time. We'll leave the rest of the story open, ready to dive deeper into the complexities of this ancient civilization and their timeless quest for immortality. As we continue to unravel the layers of ancient Egypt, we shift our gaze from the grandiose tombs of the pharaohs to the everyday lives of the people who actually made the society tick. Now, if you're picturing ancient Egyptian religion as a uniform experience, think again. The religious landscape of Egypt was as varied as the deserts and deltas that made up its geography. It was less about kneeling in solemn piety and more about rolling up your sleeves and getting things done, like ensuring your crops didn't wither faster than a pharaoh's hairstyle in a sandstorm. Take the personal shrines, for example. These were the ancient Egyptians' version of a spiritual Swiss Army knife, practical and portable. Imagine a small niche in the wall of a modest mud-brick home, adorned with figurines of household gods like Bes, the protector of hearth and home, who looked like he'd be more comfortable at a rock concert than a temple. It wasn't about grandeur, it was about getting results. Fertility, good fortune, and protection from the daily grind. These were the real currencies of faith. Now, you might think that religion was a one-size-fits-all affair, but oh, how wrong you'd be. The deities worshipped in the bustling city of Thebes weren't necessarily the same as those in a sleepy village upriver. Regional variations were the name of the game. Each community had its own pantheon of divine favorites, like a celestial playlist that catered to local tastes and needs. In Memphis, Ptah, the god of craftsmen, was a big hit, while in Elephantine, Khnum, the ram-headed god who fashioned humans on a potter's wheel, was the local celebrity. But let's talk brass tacks, or papyrus rolls, as it were. Participating in religious activities wasn't just a spiritual endeavor. It was a social obligation with a price tag that could make even the most devout reconsider. You see, temples weren't just places of worship, but social arenas where one's status could be measured by their offerings. The pressure to contribute was immense, and it wasn't just about tossing a few extra loaves of bread into the offering pile. We're talking about a serious economic commitment. Temples required donations to function, and these could range from a humble basket of produce to livestock or even labor. The societal pressure to keep up with the offerings was almost as relentless as the Nile's annual flooding. A family with a good harvest might be expected to give more, while a less fortunate household had to weigh the spiritual cost against the very real possibility of going hungry. It was a balancing act worthy of a circus, where faith and finances danced an intricate tango. And let's be real, for many, it was less about appeasing the gods and more about keeping up with the neighbors, a divine version of keeping up with the Karnakites. Now, while temples were the spiritual powerhouses, the real religious action was happening at these personal shrines and local festivals that peppered the Egyptian calendar. Imagine a scene where farmers, desperate for rain, gathered to honor the local deity with music, dance, and offerings, hoping to tip the scales in their favor. It was less about elaborate rituals and more about direct divine intervention. Think of it as a heartline to the gods, with fewer middlemen and more immediate results. Yet, all this religious fervor wasn't just for show. It was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. For the Egyptians, every action, from baking bread to plowing fields, was under the watchful eyes of gods who were as involved in the minutiae of life as they were in the grand cosmic order. The big takeaway: religion wasn't just a Sunday affair. It was a daily grind that required constant attention and investment. Now, here's where the romantic tale of divine devotion meets the stark reality of economic strain. The cost of participating in religious festivals and maintaining personal shrines was a burden not everyone could bear. While the wealthy flaunted their piety with lavish offerings and grand processions, the average Joe, or rather, the average Imhotep, had to make do with more modest contributions. This economic disparity meant that religion was as much about social standing as spiritual fulfillment. But we can't overlook the communal aspect. These gatherings and rituals fostered a sense of community and continuity, reinforcing social bonds in a world where life was as unpredictable as a two-headed snake. The festivals were as much about human connection as they were about divine appeasement, a chance to come together, share stories, maybe even enjoy a little fermented barley beverage on the side. As we delve deeper into the lives of ordinary Egyptians, it becomes clear that their religious practices were anything but monolithic. Instead, they were a tapestry of beliefs and customs, woven together by the threads of necessity and tradition. And while the gods may have been inscrutable and distant, the people who worshipped them were as relatable as any modern-day congregation juggling faith, finances, and the odd existential crisis. So, as we continue to peel back the layers of this ancient civilization, remember that the stories we uncover are more than just tales of gods and kings. They're a glimpse into the hearts and minds of people who, despite the millennia that separate us, weren't all that different from you and me, seeking meaning, security, and maybe a little divine intervention in an uncertain world. And as we leave this chapter open for further exploration, one thing's for sure: ancient Egypt still has plenty of secrets to share, and we'll be right here to unravel them, one papyrus scroll at a time. Now, let's shift our gaze to the grand finale of ancient Egyptian religion. Picture this: the sands of the Nile are shifting, and so is the cultural landscape. By the time we hit the tail end of the New Kingdom, around 1070 BCE, Egypt wasn't just hosting the original gods of the Nile anymore. Instead, they were rolling out the red carpet for a whole host of new deities, thanks to a series of foreign invasions that'd make any history buff's head spin. First up, the Libyans. They moseyed in around the 10th century BCE, bringing with them their own gods and customs. Then, the Kushites from Nubia showed up, adding their own flavor to the religious melting pot. By the time the Assyrians and Persians had their moment in the Egyptian sun, Pantheon was starting to look like a divine United Nations summit. Each wave of conquerors left its mark, reshaping Egyptian religion like clay on a potter's wheel. But don't let the romantic notion of a lost civilization fool you. Egyptian religion didn't vanish, it evolved. It was less a dramatic curtain call and more of a slow, steady fade into something new. The gods didn't just pack their bags and head for the cosmic exit. They lingered, blended, and adapted. The Egyptian deities became part of a broader Mediterranean tapestry, their stories woven into the mythologies of Greece and Rome. Isis, for example, found herself worshipped across the Roman Empire, morphing into a goddess of the sea and motherhood. The Hellenistic period, following Alexander the Great's conquest in 332 BCE, was a particular hotbed of religious fusion. The Greeks, not ones to shy away from a good deity mashup, saw parallels between their gods and the Egyptians. Enter Serapis, a hybrid god who combined aspects of Osiris and the Greek Zeus, complete with a fashionable grain basket on his head. Talk about a divine makeover. This syncretism was less about losing identity and more about broadening horizons, a testament to the Egyptians' knack for cultural adaptation. As the Romans took over in 30 BCE, the Egyptian religion continued its evolution. The pharaohs were replaced by Roman governors, but the temples remained, albeit with leaner budgets and fewer devotees. The once elaborate rituals were pared down, and the priesthood shrank, yet the core beliefs persisted, albeit in a more subdued form. It was like a classic rock band still playing gigs, but without the pyrotechnics and screaming fans. Fast forward to the rise of Christianity in the 4th century CE, and the religious scene in Egypt was undergoing another seismic shift. The new monotheistic faith, with its promise of salvation and eternal life, struck a chord in a world weary of the old gods. Temples were converted into churches, and the gods of Egypt took a back seat to the Christian saints. Yet, even in this new religious order, echoes of the ancient beliefs lingered in the form of iconography and symbolism. You could say the Egyptian gods were still hanging out backstage, influencing the show without taking center stage. It's tempting to see this as the end of an era, but in reality, it was a transformation. The ancient Egyptian religion didn't simply disappear. It left indelible marks on the world stage. The hieroglyphs, those ancient tweets of stone and papyrus, continue to speak to future generations, preserving the stories and beliefs of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Enter modern Egyptology, the field that brought these ancient tales back to life. It all kicked off with Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798, which, aside from military ambitions, sparked a fervor for all things Egyptian. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799, was the key to unlocking the hieroglyphic script, allowing scholars to finally decipher the ancient texts. Thanks to this linguistic breakthrough, the stories of gods and pharaohs, rituals, and everyday life were resurrected, captivating the imaginations of people worldwide. But let's not get too swept up in the romance. Modern Egyptology, while preserving the past, also had a flair for the dramatic. The golden treasures of Tutankhamun, unearthed in 1922, became the poster child for Egyptomania, sparking a frenzy that blended fact with fantasy. The media, ever hungry for a good story, played up the so-called curse of the pharaohs, turning ancient Egypt into a supernatural soap opera. It's a reminder that while history is about uncovering truths, it's also about storytelling, and sometimes a little embellishment sneaks in. Yet, beyond the myths and mummies, there's a profound legacy to consider. The ancient Egyptians, with their enduring quest for immortality, left behind a blueprint for understanding human existence. They taught us that religion isn't a static set of beliefs, but a living, breathing entity that evolves with the times. Their stories, from the epic battles of gods to the simple prayers of farmers, remind us of the universal quest for meaning, stability, and connection in a world that's constantly changing. So, as we wrap up this journey through the spiritual landscape of ancient Egypt, let's carry forward the lessons of adaptability and resilience. The gods of the Nile may have stepped out of the spotlight, but their influence lingers like the fading notes of a timeless tune. In the grand tapestry of history, the threads of ancient Egyptian religion continue to weave their way through our understanding of the sacred and the secular, the eternal and the ephemeral. In the end, the true legacy of ancient Egyptian spirituality isn't just about pyramids or papyrus, but the enduring human spirit that seeks to make sense of the world, one story at a time. And as we leave this chapter behind, let's remember that every tale, like every civilization, is a work in progress, waiting for the next curious mind to explore, question, and discover anew. In the bustling streets of Alexandria, where philosophers and merchants competed for attention like cats in a fish market, a young Cleopatra Roman 7 was already learning the art of survival. Born in 69 BC, Cleopatra's early life was a crash course in political chaos and familial intrigue, thanks to her father, Ptolemy Roman 12, a king with a penchant for losing his grip on power as often as he lost his sandals. Imagine it, a household where family dinners could turn into a game of who's plotting against dad today, faster than you can say pass the hummus. Cleopatra's pop, Ptolemy Roman 12 all eats. His nickname means the flute player, though whether he was any good is up for debate, was a ruler who spent more time securing his throne than actually ruling. His reign was marked by a series of diplomatic dances with Rome, who at the time was like that big, hungry neighbor who just wants to borrow a little sugar, but ends up with your whole pantry. Historical records suggest that Ptolemy Roman 12 forked over an eye-watering 6,000 talents of silver to stay in Roman good graces, which, for context, could buy you roughly 150,000 soldiers, or a lifetime supply of falafel, whichever you prefer. So, what's a young Cleopatra to do in all this madness? Well, she hit the books, hard. Cleopatra didn't just read. She inhaled knowledge like it was oxygen. The famed Library of Alexandria was practically her playground. Forget the stereotype of Cleopatra as just some glamorous seductress. The woman was a polyglot, reportedly fluent in at least 9 languages. Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Persian, the list goes on. She probably could have ordered a coffee in Latin just to show off. Some folks say she even spoke Ethiopian, which would be like picking up Klingon on the side just for the kicks. Her education wasn't just about languages, of course. Cleopatra absorbed everything from philosophy and politics to the sciences, all amidst the intellectual elite of Alexandria. Picture a place where the likes of Euclid once scribbled geometric proofs that still make high schoolers groan today. This was Cleopatra's classroom. And let's not forget the importance of rhetoric. She learned how to talk circles around her opponents, a skill that would serve her well in a world where words could be as lethal as swords. But back to the family drama. Ptolemy Roman 12 reign was a masterclass in instability. He was exiled not once but twice, first in 58 BC when he fled to Rome, leaving Cleopatra and her siblings to fend off their sister Berenice Roman 4, who seized the throne faster than you can say coup d'etat. Cleopatra must have learned early on that loyalty in the Ptolemaic dynasty was about as reliable as a papyrus umbrella in a monsoon. When Ptolemy Roman XII finally clawed his way back to power in 55 BC, with Roman support and a few brutal executions thrown in for good measure, Cleopatra was taking notes. She watched as her father swapped alliances like fashion trends, a necessary evil in an era when the wrong friends could mean a swift trip to the afterlife. Cleopatra learned that power was fickle, and the only thing more dangerous than an enemy was a family member with a grudge. Through all this, young Cleopatra was sculpting her strategic mind. She was like a chess prodigy in a world obsessed with checkers, always thinking several moves ahead. The Ptolemaic court was a living soap opera with a cast of thousands, and Cleopatra was both an avid viewer and an emerging star. She saw firsthand how the blending of diplomacy and personal charisma could turn the tides of fortune, and she was determined to master it. Cleopatra's linguistic prowess has been mythologized, wrapped in tales of seduction and cunning, but the reality was more nuanced. Her ability to speak directly to the diverse peoples of her realm was a political power play. While her predecessors often ruled from a distance, Cleopatra aimed to rule through connection. She was the first Ptolemy to actually learn the Egyptian language, a decision as strategic as it was symbolic. In a land where the gods spoke Egyptian, a Greek queen speaking the native tongue was both a nod to tradition and a bold statement of unity. Her education wasn't just about accumulating knowledge. It was about understanding power, how to wield it, how to keep it, and how to survive amidst the ever-shifting sands of political alliances. Cleopatra was learning to navigate a world where a single word could seal a deal or seal your fate. She saw how Rome, with its insatiable appetite for control, could be both a benefactor and a threat, a lesson that would become vital as she later faced down some of history's most powerful men. So, while the romanticized image of Cleopatra often highlights her later years, her early life was spent preparing for the role of a lifetime. She was the proverbial duck on water, gliding smoothly on the surface while paddling furiously beneath. Cleopatra was not just a product of her environment. She was a master of it, shaping her destiny with a blend of intellect, charm, and a dash of daring that would leave a legacy as enduring as the pyramids themselves. Cleopatra's strategic mind was honed in an environment where every nod and whisper mattered more than a golden scepter. As she clawed her way to the throne, it became clear that being the last pharaoh of Egypt wasn't going to be a cakewalk in the desert. Imagine a family reunion where the stakes are literal life and death, and you've got a sense of the Ptolemaic sibling rivalry. Her father, Ptolemy Roman XII, had barely warmed his throne again after his exile when he promptly died in 51 BC, leaving his kingdom to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy Roman XIII. Talk about sibling rivalry on steroids. Now, let's not forget that in the Ptolemaic dynasty, co-ruling with a sibling wasn't just common. It was practically a family tradition. The catch: these were not the kind of sibling partnerships that ended with shared birthday parties. Cleopatra, at around 18 years old, found herself co-ruling with a brother who was a mere 10 years old. This wasn't your typical family business. It was more like trying to run a Fortune 500 company with a partner who still needed a bedtime story. As expected, things got messy faster than an overturned chariot. Cleopatra, with her keen intellect and political acumen, quickly overshadowed her brother. Her vision for Egypt was clear. She wanted power, not just in name, but in practice. Unfortunately for her, Ptolemy Roman XIII advisors had other plans. They weren't thrilled about a woman calling the shots, and their whispers soon turned into a full-blown coup. In 48 BC, Cleopatra found herself booted from Alexandria, the city she had practically grown up plotting to rule. Enter Julius Caesar, stage right. The Roman general was in Alexandria, chasing down his own rival, Pompey, who had fled there after losing a civil war. Cleopatra saw her chance. Smuggling herself back into the palace, she supposedly rolled herself up in a carpet to meet Caesar. Now, while it makes a good story, it's more likely she presented herself in a more traditional and less rug-burn-inducing manner. Nevertheless, the image of Cleopatra unfurling at Caesar's feet is the stuff of legend, and it captures the mix of audacity and charm that defined her. Let's be real. Cleopatra wasn't just some love-struck queen batting her eyelashes at Caesar. She was a political powerhouse. Sure, Their relationship had its romantic elements. Caesar was reportedly captivated by her, but Cleopatra's motives were as clear as the Nile on a sunny day. She needed Rome's backing to reclaim her throne, and Caesar was the key. Their alliance was as much about political savvy as it was about personal chemistry. And what did Caesar get out of this? Well, besides the obvious perks of Cleopatra's company, he got a stable Egypt under his thumb, which was a boon for Roman interests. Egypt was the Roman Empire's breadbasket, and keeping it under control was crucial. Cleopatra's restoration to power wasn't just a personal victory, it was a strategic win for Rome, too. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria and faced off against her brother's forces in a showdown that would make any Game of Thrones episode look like a tea party. The civil war culminated in the Battle of the Nile in 47 BC, where Caesar's legions crushed Ptolemy Roman 13 army. The outcome: Ptolemy Roman 13 drowned in the Nile, and Cleopatra emerged victorious, solidifying her reign. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of power reclaimed. Cleopatra's rule was fraught with challenges, not least of which was the economic state of Egypt. The kingdom was in serious debt to Rome, thanks in no small part to her father's generous bribes to keep the Romans friendly. Cleopatra might have charmed Caesar, but charm doesn't pay the bills, especially when those bills are backed by the Roman Senate. Egypt's economy was a complex beast. While the Nile's fertility kept the granaries full, the kingdom's coffers were being drained by Roman demands. Cleopatra's task was to revitalize an economy that was teetering on the edge of collapse. She implemented reforms, streamlined taxes, and sought to bolster trade. But even the savviest ruler couldn't magically erase the towering debt that loomed over her reign like an ominous storm cloud. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's personal life continued to intertwine with her political ambitions. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, she aligned herself with Mark Antony, another Roman power player. Their relationship is the stuff of epic poetry, but it's crucial to remember that, for Cleopatra, this was as much a strategic alliance as a romantic one. Antony was one of the most powerful men in Rome, and Cleopatra needed a strong Roman ally to maintain her position. Yet, as with all things Cleopatra, there was more to the story. The union between Antony and Cleopatra was also a merging of economies and military might. Together, they ruled over a vast territory, but the weight of Rome's expectations and the ever-present spectre of debt never fully lifted. The Romans still viewed Egypt as their cash cow, and Cleopatra's reign, though glittering with promise, was always under the shadow of Roman control. While Cleopatra is often remembered for her legendary beauty and romantic liaisons, it's her political acumen and tenacity that truly defined her. She was a queen who played the Game of Thrones with unmatched skill, navigating a world where every decision was a double-edged sword. Cleopatra wasn't just surviving. She was redefining what it meant to be a ruler in a man's world, wielding power with a deftness that left a mark on history far beyond her years. As Egypt's last pharaoh, she was both the end of an era and the beginning of a legend that would captivate imaginations for millennia. As we continue to unravel Cleopatra's story, remember, behind every myth is a reality that is often more intriguing than fiction. Cleopatra was far more than a pretty face. She was a force of nature, a woman who stood at the crossroads of history and carved her path with wit, wisdom, and a touch of the dramatic. And her tale is far from over. As we dive deeper into Cleopatra's story, let's shift our gaze to one of history's most epic alliances, Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Now, if you thought Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar was a power couple move, her partnership with Antony was like taking that playbook, setting it on fire, and writing a new one with a quill dipped in pure ambition. These two were the Beyonce and Jay-Z of the ancient world, minus the music, but with plenty of drama. Mark Antony, one of Rome's most influential generals, wasn't just any Roman bigwig. He was the guy who could make or break empires with a wave of his toga. After Caesar's assassination, Antony found himself in a precarious position, juggling power in Rome with the subtlety of a circus performer. Cleopatra, seeing a golden opportunity, aligned herself with Antony, not just for the romance, though their love story had more fireworks than a 4th of July party, but for the political clout it gave her. A quick detour into Antony's background. He was a man of contradictions. a soldier with a penchant for partying, a leader who could inspire loyalty as easily as he could squander it. When Antony and Cleopatra joined forces, they weren't just merging territories. They were combining the economic power of Egypt with the military might of Rome. This was less about candlelit dinners and more about strategic planning over maps and ledgers. But let's not gloss over the elephant in the room. At the same time Antony was whispering sweet nothings to Cleopatra, he was also married to Octavia, the sister of Octavian, later Augustus Caesar, Rome's rising star. Talk about keeping your options open, Antony. His alliance with Cleopatra was a political gamble that would make Vegas look like child's play. Together, Antony and Cleopatra ruled over a formidable domain, stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to North Africa. Their court was the height of opulence, or so the stories go. In reality, while they might have thrown lavish parties, the real work was done in the shadows. Cleopatra was the master of fiscal maneuvering, balancing the books like a Wall Street wizard in a world where the concept of credit was as stable as a chariot with 3 wheels. Now, let's talk about the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, a naval throwdown that was less clash of the titans and more clash of the bank statements. The stakes were sky high. Antony and Cleopatra's forces squared off against Octavian's fleet, and it was sink or swim time in the truest sense. The battle took place off the coast of Greece, near Actium, and it wasn't just a military engagement, it was a propaganda war too. Octavian's spin doctors worked overtime, painting Cleopatra as the evil seductress who had bewitched Antony, leading him astray from his Roman duties. Talk about bad press. The clash itself was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. Their fleet was outmaneuvered, and as the battle turned against them, they were forced to flee. The defeat at Actium marked the beginning of the end for Cleopatra's reign. But let's put this in context. While it's easy to romanticize the dramatic escape, it was a logistical nightmare. The loss wasn't just about pride, it was about resources. Antony and Cleopatra left behind a significant portion of their navy, and with it, their best chance at turning the tides. The aftermath of Actium was a scramble for survival. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, now facing the grim reality that her kingdom was on borrowed time. The economic pressures were immense. The debt to Rome was as pressing as ever, and with her military diminished, Cleopatra had to rely on her wits more than ever. Think of her as Egypt's CEO, frantically trying to keep the company afloat while shareholders, namely Rome, circled like vultures. Debunking myths about Cleopatra's grandeur is essential here. While she's often depicted as a queen surrounded by luxury, the truth is she was more like a juggler with a penchant for the dramatic. Yes, she lived in splendor, but it was a facade masking the economic tightrope she walked. Cleopatra's Egypt was rich in resources, but poor in liquidity. Her reign was a masterclass in fiscal improvisation, trying to keep the Roman creditors at bay while maintaining the illusion of a powerful and independent kingdom. Her enemies used every trick in the book to undermine her credibility. Octavian's propaganda machine portrayed Cleopatra as the villain, the foreign temptress leading Rome's finest astray with her charm and wit. This narrative was so effective that it endured for centuries, overshadowing her political savvy and strategic brilliance. But Cleopatra wasn't just a femme fatale. She was a ruler who understood the complexities of power in a world dominated by men. As we continue to explore Cleopatra's legacy, remember that behind the myth is a story of resilience and resourcefulness. She was a woman who dared to play the game on her terms, facing down some of history's most formidable foes with a combination of charisma, intelligence, and a dash of audacity. The legend of Cleopatra is compelling, but the reality is even more so. A tale of a queen who fought to the very end, not just for herself, but for the survival of her kingdom. And while the conclusion of her story looms, there's still more to uncover about Egypt's last pharaoh and her indelible impact on history. So, as Cleopatra's story sails into its final chapters, let's set the scene. The aftermath of the Battle of Actium left Cleopatra and Antony with fewer options than a buffet at closing time. They returned to Egypt like a pair of high rollers who just lost big in Vegas, facing the harsh reality that they were down to their last chips. The grandeur of Alexandria must have seemed a little less glittering, the palace corridors a bit too silent. Internally, Cleopatra faced the kind of economic pressures that would make even the most seasoned Wall Street banker break out in hives. Egypt was teetering on financial ruin, with debts to Rome stacked higher than the pyramids. Cleopatra's once vast resources were dwindling faster than a sandcastle in a storm. She was juggling an economy that relied on the Nile's bounty while trying to fend off Roman creditors who were less patient than a cat with a laser pointer. Externally, the political landscape was just as grim. Octavian, the man who'd eventually rebrand himself as Augustus Caesar, was on a warpath to consolidate power and carve out a legacy that would make him the poster boy of Roman emperors. Cleopatra and Antony were the thorn in his sandal, and Octavian was not a man who let irritations fester. He had the Roman Senate and a formidable military machine at his disposal, not to mention a propaganda network that could have given modern social media a run for its money. The narrative was clear. Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was the ultimate femme fatale, the foreign witch leading noble Antony astray. Now, let's bust one of the most enduring myths of all, Cleopatra's death by snakebite. The romantic image of Cleopatra clasping an asp to her bosom, bidding farewell with a poetic sigh, is as appealing as it is misleading. In reality, the logistics of dying by snakebite are far less graceful. Venomous snakes aren't exactly reliable executioners. They're more likely to slither away or bite, an inconvenient guard, and perform on cue. What's more probable is that Cleopatra's death was a calculated act of realpolitik. She knew the game was up. Octavian was closing in, and Cleopatra realized that her capture would mean a humiliating parade through Rome, an indelible mark of triumph for Octavian, and a bitter end for her legacy. She was savvy enough to know that a public spectacle would reduce her to a footnote in Rome's victory lap, with her power and dignity stripped away. So how did Cleopatra really spend her final days? Well, she wasn't wallowing in a bubble bath of tears. Instead, she was negotiating right up until the end, trying to secure a future for her children. She was a mother, after all, and her kids were the last vestige of her legacy. She met with Octavian, offering him the treasures of Egypt, perhaps hoping to buy time or mercy. Yet Octavian was as unmoved as a marble statue. He wanted her as a trophy, not as a ruler. In the end, Cleopatra chose to exit on her terms, likely using a fast-acting poison rather than a theatrical snake. Her death was less about romance and more about control. She denied Octavian the spectacle he craved, preserving a sliver of sovereignty in her demise. It was a final act of defiance, a last chess move from a queen who played the game to the bitter end. Her death marked the close of an era, not just for Egypt, but for the entire Mediterranean world. With Cleopatra gone, the Ptolemaic dynasty collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Egypt, the jewel of the Nile, was absorbed into the Roman Empire, transforming from a sovereign kingdom into a Roman province. No longer a player in the Game of Thrones, Egypt became the empire's granary, its riches fueling Rome's expansion. Yet Cleopatra's legacy is far more complex than a mere footnote in Rome's triumph. She was a ruler who dared to wield power in a world where women were expected to adorn thrones, not command them. Her life was a testament to resilience, intelligence, and audacity, a blend of traits that ensured her story would echo through history, long after the dust had settled on the sands of Alexandria. Cleopatra's tale is not just a Shakespearean tragedy. It's a saga of ambition and survival, charisma and cunning. She was a queen who danced on the razor's edge of power, a figure who understood that in the high-stakes game of politics, sometimes the best you can do is control your own narrative. Her end was dramatic, yes, but it was also a potent reminder that in the game of history, the players may change, but the rules remain as unforgiving as ever. And while Rome celebrated its victory, Cleopatra's legend began its own journey, one that would captivate imaginations far beyond the reach of any empire. But let's press pause on the Roman victory parade and take a moment to appreciate Cleopatra's posthumous glow-up. After her dramatic exit, Rome wasted no time in reriding her story, casting her as the ultimate villainess in their grand narrative. Octavian, never one to miss a PR opportunity, portrayed her as the wicked enchantress who had led noble Antony astray. The Romans needed a scapegoat, and Cleopatra, with her exotic allure and formidable intellect, fit the bill perfectly. In their eyes, she wasn't just a queen. She was a cautionary tale about the dangers of foreign influence and female power. If she were alive today, she'd probably be trending on social media as the original femme fatale. But history's a funny thing. It doesn't sit still. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and Cleopatra's image has undergone more makeovers than a celebrity on a comeback tour. While the Romans saw her as a threat, modern interpretations have recast Cleopatra as a feminist icon, a woman who played the power game with a deftness that left even her most formidable male counterparts wary. She was a ruler who embraced her femininity not as a weakness, but as a tool of political mastery. She was the Beyoncé of the ancient world, commanding respect and wielding influence with a blend of charisma and cunning. The enduring fascination with Cleopatra isn't just about the legends, it's about what they reveal about us. Her story has been reshaped and repurposed to reflect the values and anxieties of each era. In the 19th century, she was romanticized as a tragic heroine, her life and loves immortalized in art and literature. In the 20th century, she became a symbol of female empowerment, her intelligence and ambition celebrated in ways that would have made Octavian spin in his laurel wreath. Yet, amidst the myth-making and myth-busting, what remains constant is the allure of Cleopatra's persona. She was a sovereign in a man's world, a ruler who defied conventions and dared to wield power on her terms. She spoke multiple languages, understood the intricacies of geopolitics, and wasn't afraid to use her charm as a strategic asset. Underneath the layers of legend, Cleopatra was, at her core, a pragmatist. She understood that politics was a game of perception as much as reality, and she played that game like a maestro. Economically, Cleopatra's reign was a tightrope walk over a financial abyss. Egypt was the ancient world's breadbasket, its granaries feeding Rome's ever-expanding appetites. But the price of keeping the peace with Rome was steep, and Cleopatra had to navigate the fiscal minefield left by her predecessors. She leveraged Egypt's resources with the skill of a Wall Street trader, balancing domestic needs with the demands of her Roman creditors. Her mastery of economic policy was as vital to her reign as any military alliance. It was a high-stakes game, and Cleopatra was all in. But let's not forget the human side of Cleopatra's story. She was a mother, a lover, and a ruler, juggling roles with the dexterity of a seasoned performer. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just political maneuvers. They were deeply personal relationships that shaped the course of her life and the fate of her kingdom. Cleopatra was a queen who understood the power of partnership, and she wielded it with a savvy that rivaled the best of Rome's statesmen. Her legacy is a testament to the power of narrative. While Cleopatra's life was marked by political intrigue and personal drama, her story transcends the confines of her time. She remains a figure of intrigue and inspiration, her image evolving with each retelling. In an age where women still fight for a seat at the table, Cleopatra's story is a reminder of the complexities and contradictions of power. She was a trailblazer who refused to be defined by the limitations of her gender or her era. As we wrap up this journey through Cleopatra's life, let's take a moment to consider the broader implications of her story. Cleopatra's tale is a vivid illustration of how history is shaped not just by events, but by the stories we tell about them. Her life was a tapestry of ambition, intelligence, and resilience, woven into the fabric of a world dominated by men. She was a ruler who understood that power was not just about wealth or armies, but about perception and influence. In the end, Cleopatra's enduring legacy is a testament to her indomitable spirit. She was a queen who dared to dream big, to challenge the status quo, and to carve out her own destiny in a world that sought to confine her. Her life was a masterclass in the art of leadership, and her story is a powerful reminder of the timeless allure of an enigmatic ruler who played her cards with unforgettable flair. So, as you drift off with Cleopatra's saga swirling in your mind, remember this. Behind the myths and the romance, the drama and the intrigue, lies a story of a woman who was unapologetically herself, a queen who dared to rule in a world that wasn't ready for her but couldn't ignore her. Cleopatra's legacy is a beacon of resilience and ambition, a testament to the power of one woman's vision and the enduring allure of a story well told. In the dusty streets of ancient Athens, where the air was thick with philosophical debate and the scent of olive oil, a political whirlwind named Cleisthenes was about to turn the city-state on its head. This wasn't your typical toga-wearing aristocrat with a penchant for wine and poetry. No, Cleisthenes was more like a political gladiator, ready to tussle with the big boys and leave a legacy that would echo through the annals of history. But before we get to the part where he gifts Athens the sparkly new concept of democracy, let's rewind to a time when the city was more chaotic than a toga party gone wrong. The late 6th century BCE in Athens wasn't exactly the golden age of harmony and unity. Think of it more like a dysfunctional family reunion, complete with bickering relatives and that one cousin who insists on bringing up old feuds. The city was a patchwork of rival factions, each one more eager than the last to claim a piece of the political pie. It was a time when power shifted about as frequently as today's celebrity breakups, and alliances were as reliable as a papyrus umbrella. Enter Hippias, the tyrant whose reign over Athens was less about benevolent leadership and more about maintaining control through fear and intimidation. Hippias had inherited the tyranny from his father, Pisistratos, who, let's be honest, had a knack for seizing power that would make even the most ambitious of reality TV stars blush. When Pisistratos first grabbed the reins of Athens around 561 BCE, he did so with a mix of charm and cunning, eventually passing the torch, or rather the scepter, to his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus. Now, Hippias wasn't exactly the poster child for tyranny. Initially, he wasn't too bad, but the murder of his brother Hipparchus in 514 BCE sent him spiraling down a path of paranoia and cruelty. It was like the ancient equivalent of a villain origin story. Fearful for his life and desperate to cling to power, Hippias tightened his grip on Athens, turning the city into more of a police state than a thriving democracy in the making. He was the kind of leader who inspired as much love as a tax audit, and had about as many friends in the political arena. This is where Cleisthenes steps into the spotlight, ready to wrestle control away from the increasingly unpopular tyrant. But his motivations weren't purely altruistic. Cleisthenes came from the Alchemianid family, a clan with enough political ambition to give the Kardashians a run for their money. The family's history was peppered with intrigue and scandal, including a notorious curse for sacrilege that they seemed to wear like a badge of honor. It was like an ancient soap opera, full of twists, turns, and the occasional banishment. Cleisthenes' beef with Hippias was less about personal vendetta and more about reclaiming power and status for his family. They had been on the outs since the days of Pisistratos, who had exiled them in a move that was as much about consolidating his own power as it was about eliminating rivals. But Cleisthenes wasn't one to let bygones be bygones. He had a plan, and it involved more than just toppling a tyrant. It involved reshaping Athens into something it had never been before, a democracy. In a move that would make Machiavelli proud, Cleisthenes began to scheme. He knew that to oust Hippias, he'd need more than just his family's support. He'd need the backing of the people, the very foundation of Athens' future democracy. So he set about building alliances, wooing the common folk with promises of power and participation, something they hadn't had much of under the tyrants. It was like the ancient version of a grassroots campaign, with Cleisthenes as the charismatic candidate promising change. As the political tension in Athens reached a boiling point, Cleisthenes made his move. In 510 BCE, with a little help from his friends, namely the Spartans, who were always up for a good overthrow, Hippias was finally ousted from power. The tyrant was sent packing, and the stage was set for Cleisthenes to implement his grand vision. But don't be fooled into thinking this was the end of Athens' political turmoil. If anything, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see Cleisthenes wrestling with the complexities of creating a system that was as innovative as it was precarious. Cleisthenes' reforms were about more than just settling old scores. They were about redefining what it meant to be Athenian, to have a voice in the decisions that shaped their city. He proposed a new political structure that shifted power away from the aristocratic families and into the hands of the people. It wasn't an easy sell, especially to those who'd grown accustomed to wielding unchecked influence. But Cleisthenes was nothing if not persuasive, and his vision of a more egalitarian Athens struck a chord with the masses. As we leave Cleisthenes at this pivotal moment, poised to unveil the reforms that would lay the groundwork for democracy as we know it, remember that his journey wasn't just about political ambition or family drama. It was about planting the seeds of a revolution that would transform not only Athens, but the entire concept of governance. And while the road to democracy would be anything but smooth, with plenty of bumps and detours along the way, Cleisthenes' legacy would endure long after the dust of ancient Athens had settled. So, with the tyrant Hippias out of the picture, and the Athenian political stage cleared for a new act, Cleisthenes had his work cut out for him. He wasn't just trying to shuffle some chairs around. He was about to take Athens' centuries-old political structure and give it a makeover so radical it would make a reality TV home renovation look like a paint job. Imagine trying to break up entrenched power blocks that had been around since your great-great-grandpappy was a twinkle in his father's eye. That's the Rubik's Cube Cleisthenes was about to tackle, except he decided to do it blindfolded and with one hand tied behind his back. Here's the deal. Athens was traditionally divided into 4 tribes, each ruled by a handful of aristocratic families who had the city wrapped around their little fingers. It was like a VIP club where the entry fee was your bloodline, and Cleisthenes was about to throw open the doors to the common folk. His plan, a political Frankenstein's monster of sorts, reorganizing Athens from 4 tribes into 10 new ones. This was no mere cosmetic change. Cleisthenes was rewriting the city's political DNA. Each of these 10 tribes would consist of people from different regions, mixing city dwellers, coastal residents, and those from inland areas. It was like taking your grandma's secret cookie recipe and adding a pinch of everything from the spice rack. Now, let's talk about the nitty-gritty. Cleisthenes didn't just scribble out a new map over a cup of wine, created new political units called demes. Think of them as districts or neighborhoods, but with a political twist. There were about 139 demes in total, each belonging to one of the 10 new tribes. These demes were the building blocks of Cleisthenes' new political order, and the genius of it was how it diluted the power of the old aristocratic families. It was like teaching a wolf pack to play nice by throwing in a bunch of sheep and hoping for the best. The beauty, or madness, of this system was in its randomness. It was designed to break up old allegiances and force Athenians to look beyond their own backyard when it came to political loyalty. Suddenly, people who had never met before were supposed to see each other as tribe members, which, let's be honest, probably led to some pretty awkward first meetings. Imagine showing up to your first tribe assembly and not knowing a soul. It's like being the new kid at school, except your classmates are all speaking ancient Greek and asking about your stance on grain tariffs. This was all part of Cleisthenes' masterstroke to ensure no single family or faction could dominate the political landscape. By making each tribe a mix of different regions, he effectively cut the legs out from under the old power brokers. It was a political leveling of the playing field, if by leveling we mean bulldozing the whole thing and starting fresh. The old aristocrats, who had built their empires on familial ties and local loyalties, suddenly found themselves in a political game where the rules had been rewritten and they were playing catch-up. As you can imagine, this radical overhaul didn't happen without a few grumbles and raised eyebrows. Change is never easy, especially when it involves telling people they no longer belong to the tribe they've identified with for generations. Some Athenians probably felt like Cleisthenes had just handed them a map to Narnia and told them to find their new political home. But the brilliance of this reorganization was that it fostered a sense of unity beyond the old family feuds and localized disputes. It was the ancient equivalent of a trust fall, and the Athenians had to hope that Cleisthenes knew what he was doing. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't just about creating a happy-go-lucky democracy where everyone held hands and sang hymns to Athena. Cleisthenes had a pragmatic streak that would make a modern politician nod in approval. By breaking the power of the aristocratic families, he was also securing his own position and that of his family. It was a political chess move worthy of a grandmaster. Cleisthenes wasn't just playing the game. He was rewriting the rules to ensure that the game itself was fair, or at least as fair as you could get in ancient Athens. Whether or not all Athenians immediately saw the genius of Cleisthenes' reforms is up for debate. Some probably grumbled about the new system, like your uncle complains about the latest smartphone update. But the fact is, Cleisthenes' reorganization of the tribes and the creation of demes laid the groundwork for a more inclusive political system. It was a revolution wrapped in a bureaucracy, and it forced Athenians to think beyond their own little corner of the city. As the dust settled on this new political landscape, Cleisthenes had successfully transformed Athens into something it had never been before. a city where power wasn't just the plaything of the few. It was a bold experiment, and like any good experiment, it had its share of trial and error. But Cleisthenes was nothing if not determined, and his vision of a more democratic Athens would set the stage for future generations to build upon. So, while some Athenians were still scratching their heads trying to figure out which tribe they belonged to, Cleisthenes was already looking ahead. This was just the beginning of his grand plan, and as we'll see, there were more changes on the horizon that would continue to shape the destiny of Athens. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the political roller coaster that was Cleisthenes' Athens, where the next twist and turn is never far away. As Cleisthenes set his sights on the next phase of his democratic makeover, he turned his attention to the Athenian council, known as the Bull. Now, if you're thinking this is just some dusty old committee, think again. The Bull was the linchpin of Athens' new political machine, and Cleisthenes was about to give it a turbocharged engine by expanding it to 500 members. That's right, 500. If you're imagining the logistical nightmare of getting that many people to agree on anything, well, welcome to the ancient Athenian version of herding cats. This wasn't just about adding a bunch of seats for the sake of inclusivity, though. Cleisthenes had a method to his democratic madness. By expanding the council, he was ensuring that each of the newly minted 10 tribes had an equal voice, with 50 representatives each. This was a bold move to dilute the power of the aristocracy and make sure no single tribe could dominate the conversation. It was like assembling a jury where everyone gets a say, and no one can hog the gavel. But let's not kid ourselves. Expanding the Bull wasn't just about noble ideals. It was a logistical feat that required some serious ancient Greek ingenuity. Picture this. You've got 500 council members, each with their own opinions, agendas, and let's be honest, a penchant for drama. You think Cleisthenes was casting for the next great theatrical tragedy. And the kicker, these weren't just any citizens. They were chosen by lot, a kind of democratic lottery that was as much about chance as it was about representation. Imagine your number coming up and suddenly finding yourself responsible for shaping the future of democracy. Talk about pressure. Now, let's dive into the economic nitty-gritty of keeping this political circus running. Athens wasn't exactly rolling in drachmas, so funding this expanded council was no small feat. Each member of the Bull needed to be compensated for their time, because, let's face it, no one works for free, not even in ancient Greece. This meant that the city had to find a way to cover the costs, which included everything from daily stipends for council members to the upkeep of meeting spaces. The funding came from a combination of sources, including taxes and tributes from Athens' allies and subject states. It was a delicate balance, like spinning plates while riding a unicycle. Too much pressure on the citizens, and you'd have a revolt on your hands. Too little funding, and the whole democratic experiment would come crashing down like a house of cards. Cleisthenes had to walk a tightrope, ensuring that the financial burden wasn't too great for the average Athenian while still keeping the council's wheels greased. So, how did this newly expanded Bull function? Well, in theory, it was a well-oiled machine where proposals could be debated, amended, and sent to the larger assembly for a vote. In practice, it was probably more like a rowdy town hall meeting where everyone had something to say, and no one was shy about saying it. The council met on the Pnyx, a hill overlooking Athens, where the acoustics were as unforgiving as the Mediterranean sun. Trying to get 500 people to agree on anything was like trying to get a room full of toddlers to take a nap. Passable, but not without a lot of noise and the occasional tantrum. And then there was the matter of getting so many people to actually show up. Remember, this was long before the days of email reminders or Google Calendar alerts. Council members were expected to attend meetings regularly, and there were fines for excessive absenteeism. Clearly, Cleisthenes was ahead of his time in recognizing the value of a good attendance policy. But let's be real. There were always going to be those who'd rather be lounging in the agora than hashing out policy on a hot summer day. Despite the challenges, this expansion of the Bull was a critical step in Cleisthenes' plan to create a more participatory government. It was about more than just numbers. It was about giving ordinary Athenians a voice in their city's future. Sure, it may have felt like organizing a family reunion where nobody gets along. It was a crucial experiment in democracy that laid the groundwork for the political systems we recognize today. As the bull took its seat at the helm of Athenian politics, Cleisthenes was steering Athens toward uncharted waters. The stakes were high, and the challenges were many, but this was a city ready to embrace change. And while the path to a fully functioning democracy was littered with potholes and detours, Cleisthenes' vision was clear. He was reshaping not just a city, but the very idea of governance. And in doing so, he was setting a precedent that would echo down through the ages, proving that sometimes the only way to change the game is to change the rules entirely. So, as Cleisthenes watched this new political landscape unfold, he knew that the road ahead would be anything but smooth. But with the wind of change at his back and the promise of a new Athens on the horizon, he was ready to face whatever came next. After all, in the grand scheme of things, what's a little chaos when you're building the future of democracy? Stay tuned as we delve deeper into Cleisthenes' Athens, where the next chapter promises to be just as thrilling as the last. Now, with Athens sailing into these uncharted democratic waters, Cleisthenes had one more ace up his toga sleeve, a little thing called ostracism. If you're imagining a bunch of toga-clad Athenians playing a game of musical chairs with political careers on the line, you're not far off. Ostracism was Cleisthenes' innovative way of tossing out power-hungry politicians like yesterday's leftovers. Think of it as democracy's early warning system, with a side of public shaming. Here's the lowdown. Once a year, Athenians gathered to decide if any of their number needed a 10-year sabbatical from the city. And by sabbatical, I mean being kicked out of Athens, forced to take up residence elsewhere, and reflect on their questionable life choices. Imagine a political timeout, but with a much longer duration and no comfy chair to sit in. To make it happen, at least 6,000 citizens had to scribble a name on a piece of pottery. Yes, pottery. Called an ostracon, this shard was the ancient equivalent of a tweet, short and to the point. Get out. Now, don't let the romantic image of democratic pottery fool you. This was serious business. The idea was to prevent any one person from becoming too powerful, a lesson learned from their tyrant-busting days. But like any good plan, it had its share of hiccups. First, there was the challenge of gathering 6,000 people in one place with no mics or megaphones, just the booming voices of town criers. Next, consider the logistics of counting and verifying scribbled names without Excel spreadsheets. It was a process that required a blend of patience and a keen eye for detail, not to mention a healthy dose of skepticism about the authenticity of certain ostraca. And of course, not every ostracism was straightforward. The system could become a tool for rival factions to sideline their competition, a sort of political cleansing masquerading as civic duty. Imagine being on the receiving end of such a vote. 1 minute, you're a bustling politician. The next, you're stuffing your belongings into a sack, wondering if your ostracon was penned by a genuine critic or your neighbor with a grudge about last week's goat theft. But let's not pretend that this system was all doom and gloom. There was a certain comedic value in watching powerful men tremble at the thought of public opinion carved into clay. The drama, the anticipation, was your name in the hat, or rather, on the shard. It was like an ancient Greek reality show, with all the suspense and none of the commercial breaks. The potential for humiliation kept even the most ambitious in check, knowing that their next big idea could land them a decade-long holiday. Some of the greatest facepalms in Athenian history came from those who didn't see their ostracism coming. Take Themistocles, the brilliant naval strategist who helped defeat the Persians at Salamis in 480 BCE. Despite his heroics, he found himself on the wrong end of an ostracon just a few years later. It's a classic tale of what have you done for us lately? In political terms, even the mighty could fall victim to the whims of public opinion, proving that fame is as fleeting as an Athenian summer breeze. But why did ostracism matter? It wasn't just about maintaining power balance. It was a societal pressure valve. By giving citizens a peaceful way to curb rising stars before they could become tyrants, Athens avoided the violent upheavals that plagued other city-states. This wasn't just a clever trick. It was a necessity in a world where political ambition often translated to military coups. Through ostracism, Athenians were invited to weigh the scales of power every year, reminding leaders that their authority was a privilege, not a right. The economic impact of ostracism was also noteworthy. Leaders who found themselves exiled took their wealth and influence with them, often leaving behind a void that could shift fiscal dynamics. While some might argue this was a drain on resources, others saw it as a fresh opportunity for new leaders to emerge, bringing innovative ideas and economic strategies to the fore. It was a double-edged sword, balancing the removal of influential figures with the potential for economic renewal. Yet, the system wasn't foolproof. There were always those who managed to sidestep the shards of destiny, using their resources and connections to influence the outcome. It's a reminder that even in its infancy, democracy was susceptible to the machinations of the savvy and the well-connected. Still, ostracism stood as a testament to the Athenian commitment to equality and accountability, a nod to their desire to build a society where no one man could claim absolute power. As we continue this journey through Cleisthenes' Athens, remember that the seeds of democracy were planted in rocky soil, nurtured by both idealism and pragmatism. The introduction of ostracism was not just a clever trick to keep politicians honest. It was a fundamental shift in how power was perceived and wielded. Athens was learning to walk the tightrope of democracy, balancing ambition and equality with the grace of an acrobat and the tenacity of a marathon runner. So, as Cleisthenes' reforms continued to reshape the city, the Athenians remained vigilant, pottery shards at the ready, always prepared to cast their vote and keep their leaders in check. The road to democracy was long and winding, but with each step, Athens moved closer to a more equitable future, one ostracon at a time. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the next chapter of this political odyssey, where the twists and turns are as unpredictable as the Athenian weather. As we continue to traverse the winding roads of ancient Athens, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of Cleisthenes' reforms. This was a man who looked at the political landscape of his day and thought, you know what this needs? A shake-up that would make a snow globe look stable. But before we darn our rose-tinted glasses and hail him as the father of democracy, let's pause to consider just what kind of legacy Cleisthenes left behind. While it's tempting to envision Cleisthenes as the sage architect of democracy, the reality is a little more complex. Sure, he laid the groundwork for a political system that would inspire generations, but it's worth noting that democracy didn't blossom overnight like some mythical flower. In fact, the road to the democracy we recognize today was more like an ancient version of a never-ending road trip, full of bumps, detours, and the occasional flat tire. Cleisthenes' reforms were revolutionary, no doubt about it. He took a city shackled by aristocratic power and tossed the keys to the people. But let's not forget that the Athens of Cleisthenes' day was still a far cry from a true democracy. Women, slaves, and non-citizens were about as likely to vote as a fish was to walk on land. The political stage was reserved for the male citizens of Athens, a small fraction of the population. In a city of around 300,000 people, only about 30,000 qualified as full citizens. The rest, well, they were left to watch from the sidelines, probably grumbling about taxation without representation. And then there's the economic reality of Cleisthenes' Athens. It's easy to romanticize the idea of democracy as a beacon of equality and justice, but someone had to foot the bill for all those political experiments. Athens relied heavily on the wealth generated by its silver mines at Laurium, along with tributes from its allies and subject states. These funds kept the political machine oiled and the boule functioning, but they also tied Athens' fortunes to the whims of international politics. It was a delicate dance, like balancing on a tightrope while juggling flaming torches. Exciting, but one wrong move and you're toast. As for Cleisthenes himself, his legacy is as much about what he inspired as what he achieved. He set the stage for future leaders like Pericles to take the Athenian experiment to new heights. Pericles, with his flair for public speaking and eye for urban development, turned Athens into a cultural powerhouse. But he also learned from Cleisthenes' successes and failures, recognizing the importance of keeping the people engaged and invested in their governance. Cleisthenes may have planted the seeds, but it was leaders like Pericles who tended the garden. Still, the romantic notion of Cleisthenes as democracy's founding father persists, and perhaps that's because we humans love a good origin story. There's an allure to the idea of one man single-handedly turning the tide of history, but reality is often messier. Cleisthenes was a shrewd politician with a knack for survival and a talent for seeing the bigger picture. His reforms were as much about securing his own position as they were about empowering the people. But isn't that the nature of politics? A blend of idealism and pragmatism, ambition and altruism, qualities that haven't changed much over the centuries. The mythic status of Cleisthenes endures because it taps into our fondness for heroes and transformational figures. We crave narratives where the good guys win and the bad guys get their comeuppance. But in the real world, change is rarely so tidy. Cleisthenes' Athens was still rife with inequality and power struggles, a reminder that democracy is not a destination, but a journey. It's a continuous process of negotiation, compromise, and evolution, an idea that Cleisthenes, no doubt, understood all too well. So, what can we take away from Cleisthenes' legacy? For one, the recognition that democracy is an ongoing experiment, constantly adapting to the needs and demands of its citizens. It's a system that requires vigilance, participation, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Cleisthenes' reforms were a bold step in this direction, but they were just the beginning. He laid the foundations, but it was up to future generations to build upon them. And let's not forget the timelessness of political ambition and gaffes. From Cleisthenes' day to our own, the political arena remains a stage for both triumph and folly. Leaders rise and fall, policies succeed and fail, and through it all, the pursuit of power and progress endures. It's a reminder that while the players may change, the game remains much the same. As we wrap up our journey through Cleisthenes' Athens, let's leave behind the myth and embrace the reality, a complex, imperfect, but ultimately inspiring tale of political innovation. Cleisthenes may not have been a flawless hero, but his audacious vision set the stage for a new chapter in human governance. And as we look back on his legacy, we can appreciate the messy, beautiful process that is democracy, knowing that its story is far from over. With that, we say farewell to Cleisthenes and his Athens, a city that dared to dream of something different, and in doing so, changed the course of history. As we close this chapter, let's carry forward the lessons of the past, ready to face the challenges of the present and the uncertainties of the future. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the journey of democracy is as unpredictable as it is essential, an adventure we're all a part of, whether we like it or not.